Joe Rogan Podcast. Check it out.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night, all day. What's up, man? How are you?
I'm good. You know, it's really exciting to be here. There was just right before we got rolling, I was mentioning, you know, I tweeted back in April. Would love to go on Joe Rogan's podcast at some point.
Is that when the documentary series came out in April?
Yeah. So it premiered in March, like end of March.
Oh.
And then it was rolled out in 2 episode per weekend installments. So it took 3 weeks for the whole thing to release, and it was actually really exciting because it was you had the audience reacting in real time. You know, there'd be a week to see, okay, well, how is the community receiving this? You know, how is the mainstream
Did you say the
media?
community?
The community.
You
yeah.
really said that?
Yeah.
Is that what they call themselves?
I mean, I have so much of this like lexicon now that I can't avoid. It's just I say
funny.
it at the beginning of the series,
Yeah.
like it seeps into your thoughts. It really does.
Right,
know?
Clinton body count, right?
Clinton
Like,
body count,
yeah.
17. Can't see that without thinking Q.
Right.
Impossible. Just a number.
Yeah. Well, it was. It's really well done. I just want to say you did a fantastic job. It's really excellent.
Thank you.
And it's such a compelling subject, and it opens up so many conversations on censorship, on like what is the truth, and how important is it to know what's real and what's not real. It's such a complex and unusual conversation that we have to have today about misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and this whole Q thing, which is just like it to me embodies the perfect example of what's like worst case scenario if someone just started making up some wild shit. We assume making up wild shit online.
It's a safe assumption.
And got an enormous group of people to go along with it, and then they wind up attacking Capitol. I mean, when they attacked the Capitol building, when they stormed the Capitol building, and you realize like, oh my God, like this is literally like the wings of the butterfly create the storm. And then here it is, like a thing that looked preposterous just a couple of years ago when people are talking about all the Q drops and all this, like the people that I knew that are into QAnon. Jamie pointed out earlier that a lot of them were the same people that are into flat Earth. It's the same sort of folks, like kind of without, uncharitable terms, unsophisticated, gullible, and into secrets, into finding out secrets.
I mean, I would say that in my experience, there weren't too many QAnons who were also big flat earthers, or maybe they had set that aside a little bit. But you see in episode 1, Liz Crokin, who is a big QTuber, big sort of celebrity in terms of like analyzing Q drops and talking about the meaning. I bring that up to her. I'm like, well, what about flat Earth? And she's like, tell me nothing's too crazy, right? And this is the thing about Q. It's like Q. And I think a lot of people were attracted to this premise because it feeds correctly into this notion that we should be skeptical of things. Was question everything. Question whether or not the Earth is flat. Question whether or not And in the beginning, that included question Q, and that faded away pretty quickly. A few months into QAnon, you could question anything as long as you didn't question Q. And it was you jumped right to January 6th, right? Sort of the finish line. And when I think of Jan 6, like I don't think it would have happened without QAnon. I also don't think it happened solely because of QAnon. Right. There were a lot of forces that coalesced that day.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100%. I think it's such a strange time, where people are learning how to use social media, and then we're also aware that social media is heavily manipulated by foreign countries. That they're, I'm sure you're aware of the Internet Research Agency in Russia, this whole, essentially a troll farm that's designed to fuck with us. And very successfully. And Renee DiResta has highlighted this really well. And it was really interesting to talk to her and find out how deep the rabbit hole goes with this stuff. And hundreds of thousands of memes, often hilarious memes, that get shared on social media, created by Russia.
I mean, can you imagine getting that job in Russia where it's like your job will be to be a meme smith?
Your job is make funny with American politics. Good luck. Yeah, like what do you, where do you start?
Yeah, that was one of the questions I've had when you're looking at something like 8chan, now 8kun, where Q had been posting. And we talk about free speech on those platforms and this idea that anyone can post whatever they want within sort of the limits of free speech, right? Like there are certain things which are illegal. But does that protect people who are abroad as well? Free speech traditionally in America would protect American citizens. But in the case of the internet, the internet is global. So that means that you can have actors in South Africa or in Russia posting on these sites protected under the same premise as what Americans are accustomed to, and able to use speech against America. In certain instances. So what you're describing, these kind of meme smiths in Russia are in some ways using free speech against us, right?
I guess. Yeah. I mean, I guess. I think what it's doing, this is an odd idea, but I think what it's doing is it's forcing us to adapt and evolve our ability to detect bullshit. And it's doing it almost like an immune system response. Like what we're reacting to and what we're recognizing from all this stuff is like, oh, we didn't know what this was. And this has resulted in this riot, whatever you want to call the Capitol Hill attack. And now we're looking at more censorship on social media. We're looking at, like them trying to batten down the hatches and figure out how to handle something like QAnon or the people that were allegedly promoting these ideas. A lot of them that are banned from social media, the stuff that you highlighted in your show. We have to figure out what's true and what's not true. And so there's been some sort of draconian measures that have been suggested. Hiring some sort of a team that goes over social media and makes sure that everything is according to what they deem to be correct or incorrect, which obviously is subject to biases. And we're very aware that that's going on today, that there's a lot of that going on today where the necessarily the truth doesn't, like the Hunter Biden laptop story is a great example of that, right? Like the social media platforms, they censored news from the New York Post, one of the oldest newspapers in America, on the Hunter Biden laptop story because they decided that somehow or another it was propaganda or somehow or another it was not good to get that information. But it was news. It was real news. It was a real story. And they decided it was too close to the election. This could hurt Biden. We don't want Trump to win. So you're dealing with biases. This is not just like simply here's information that we know to be true or here's information that we know to be a lie. We're going to stop that from getting through. No, they knew it to be true. But they decided to stop it because it wasn't convenient or it didn't fit the narrative they were trying to promote.
Right. How do you find a neutral arbiter of the truth?
Right.
If you are going to entrust someone with that responsibility. And I think it's just an incredibly slippery slope.
Incredibly slippery.
And what these big tech companies have suggested is that, well, maybe we don't use humans, maybe we use algorithms, right? To moderate everything. And the algorithms had that in many ways had bolstered something like Q, because they're basically sociopathic when it comes to just trying to drive attention as much as possible. So now they can kind of invert those algorithms and punish those who talk about that kind of content. And oftentimes, even if their goal was just to prevent I don't know, conversation around QAnon because they consider it to be problematic, what else gets swept up? What else gets swept up with that? I mean, I saw a lot of people who were reporting on QAnon, maybe coming from the side of critiquing it. Their videos were being wiped out. People who were documenting January the 6th, their content was being wiped out. People who were critical of QAnon, they had websites that were sort of on the other side. That was being wiped out as well. And that's because, of course, it's sort of this blunt force that an algorithm wields.
So people that were analyzing the movement from a critical standpoint, people who are looking like how ridiculous this is, look at this, they had their channels wiped out as well?
Yes.
So any content on QAnon, they just want to erase it from the internet, essentially.
That seemed to be the initial response. Yeah.
It's so strange that they all move together in sync.
I mean, I think that if I did not have HBO in my sails with this project, it wouldn't have seen the light of day. Really?
Like if you tried to put it on YouTube, you think?
Oh yeah. I mean, when we first released the series, there were some articles floating around like, oh, maybe this is going to make things worse. If I typed in Q into the storm into YouTube, it wouldn't auto-populate at a certain point. It started out auto-populating and then that went away. So, I wouldn't feel confident at all that, if we didn't have a gorilla in our corner, that this story that revealed ultimately who was behind QAnon would have been able to find an audience. And that
shout out to HBO.
Shout out to HBO. I mean, they really had my back.
They've been amazing for decades. You really think about it. I mean, they're the people that when Bill Maher's show Politically Incorrect got pulled off of what was it, on ABC? I forget.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Network television. They immediately took it, brought it over, turned it into real time, and made it even better. It's uncensored now, and it's, in my opinion, Real Time with Bill Maher is probably one of the very best social commentary shows and comedy shows that like really doesn't pull any punches on any network ever.
You want to hear something fucking crazy? So yes, just yesterday I was talking with someone who's helping distribute the film, and I said, well, what about Amazon? Are we going to be able to put it out on Amazon internationally? And they said, well, as of the last year, they have stopped taking documentaries. All documentaries.
What?
You cannot publish a documentary
on
their platform, and the reason was because that I was told is because, there was all this conspiracy, flat Earth stuff, and they were getting blowback. That eventually they said, we don't want to have to decide what we publish and what we don't, what's real and what's not. We're just not going to publish anything.
Oh
and
God.
The example they gave me that they couldn't get published was The Cove. I don't know if you saw that documentary.
The dolphin documentary.
Yeah, the dolphin documentary. It won an Oscar.
Yeah.
And I just to check it, I looked it up, and sure enough, The Cove wasn't available on Amazon. So, those who said that there wouldn't be a slow creep of censorship, kind of starting with things that I think everybody agrees should be, they wouldn't like to be in society. Things like the Daily Stormer. Maybe a lot of people don't want 8chan. There's a progression.
Yeah.
Until you end up. It seems like something like, the Cove can't find an audience on a major platform, and I don't want to conflate government censorship with the corporate censorship too much. However, in a lot of ways, it does feel like the government has passed the buck to these corporations to do what they legally can't, which I think is the same thing we saw the government do with privacy, right? Like, they wouldn't have been able to get all of this data from us directly, but if you give it to a Facebook or a Twitter, it's very easy for the government to then go and get access to that information. So I think what we saw happen with the Fourth Amendment, we're now seeing happen with the First Amendment, where they can say, well, look, we couldn't restrict conversation around certain topics. We couldn't directly decide what's true or what's not. We're going to put that in the hands of these companies. And of course, these companies have intimate relationships with many members of the government. There's a revolving door there. So I when people want to talk about limiting what we can say online or limiting disinformation to other things, I think that it's almost the wrong place to start. I think we have to go back to the privacy issues. And I actually think if we had not let privacy be eroded online, we wouldn't be having this debate. Because if these gigantic companies hadn't collected thousands of data points on us, didn't know our fears, our desires, if they hadn't built these psychometric profiles, they wouldn't have been able to manipulate us, use these algorithms to drive us into echo chambers, which have really created these disparate realities. And now these disparate realities can't agree necessarily on a set of facts. Sometimes you're considered, sometimes people will be ostracized for even talking to somebody from the quote unquote other side, right? And so now there's this conversation about what should be allowed to be said online. And I think that that's simply a byproduct of our privacy having been eroded. So, if I was to do anything about these issues, I would start by restoring rights. I would go back and say, all right, well, how do we get ownership and privacy rights online when it comes to our personal data? Let's start there before we start, going after the speech itself.
Do you think that the algorithms are designed to do this, or do you think that it's just a function of human nature that we tend to gravitate towards things that outrage us and then huddle up together in echo chambers? That this is just a natural tribal behavior, and that what the algorithms do is essentially just highlight what we're really interested in.
They magnify it in a feedback loop. Right. So you're right to say that humans do have these traits. And I haven't designed the algorithms, but I've also talked to people who have, and a lot of they don't even understand how they work at a certain point. Like they're off to the races.
Have you seen The Social Dilemma?
Yeah. Yeah.
What'd you think about that?
It's great. It's
amazing,
great.
Right?
Yeah.
Scary too. The conclusions that they draw.
Oh, certainly. I mean, I made a film about 8 years ago called Terms and Conditions May Apply. And that came out right before the Edward Snowden revelations. And when it came out, the initial response was like, oh, this is maybe conspiratorial. Surely the government doesn't have this much insight into our behavior and access to our devices and our personal information. And then the Snowden revelations came out, and then it was like, oh, well, maybe the series didn't go far enough. And back then we had talked about the idea of how is technology influencing us? How is it changing us, manipulating us? And it didn't feel like that was the biggest story at the time. And this question of privacy and how our rights are being eroded through these agreements that nobody ever really reads, and you could find all kinds of juicy tidbits hidden in there in terms of what the companies were actually doing, and kind of revealing this unholy collusion between the government and big tech. But at the time, people would often say, well, what's the cost? What's the big deal if they're mining my personal data to serve me with ads? Yeah. And I'd say that the environment we find ourselves in now is the cost.
Do you do anything to personally protect your data? Do you use DuckDuckGo for searches and things along those lines? Use Brave as a browser. Do you do that stuff?
All that, yeah. Use Signal.
VPNs.
Mm-hmm, yeah. VPNs. I mean, I do my best, if a government actor really wants to get at you, they're going to be able to.
Yeah.
I mean, you saw the NSO clickless spyware story,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
I mean, if there's a 0 day that allows you to get access to a microphone and everything that someone's doing on their phone without them even having to click on a link, it's game over. Of course, governments will abuse that.
Yeah, and probably are right now.
Yeah. Where are our phones at?
Right there. Yeah, it's interesting because you would think that there would be a market for a platform that becomes bulletproof And there have been some, Linux-based cell phone operating system phones that they sell. Like they buy a phone, you get a Google phone, they de-Google it and put different software on it and stuff. But I'm not sure if that's like, if you're deluding yourself into believing that you're actually protected with that stuff, or you actually are protected.
Right.
I would think they could work around all those things, especially something that's, it's essentially like open source, right? Like if it's a Linux-based operating system, there's some super geniuses out there. I'm sure they're going to be able to hack into that.
Yeah, I think with stuff like Signal, you're just protecting yourself as best you can.
Right.
You use something that's end-to-end encrypted. You're doing better than 99% of people who are out there. You're making somebody really have to work to get access to your stuff. And if you're using a VPN and you're using DuckDuckGo, then you're minimizing your digital footprint. And you're not worth as much to these companies, and they're not able to manipulate you, I guess, in the same way through these algos. But let me ask you this. What would you do about the algorithm problem, right? Because on the one hand, algorithms are necessary for something like a search engine. On the other hand, they drive the most sensational content, things like QAnon, and I think have largely facilitated the situation we find ourselves in now. It's
a really interesting question because on one hand, for me, like when I go to my YouTube page, it highlights the things that I'm interested in. And when I go to YouTube in general, I'm interested in entertainment. That's all I get. I have a very boring YouTube page. If you go to it, there's a few political talk shows that I listen to, like Breaking Points and Jimmy Dore and Kyle Kalinske and a few other folks. And then there's a lot of like billiards matches and Muay Thai fights. Like that's like most of my YouTube. So it's boring. It's like for the average person, it's not suggesting anything to me that's going to be that it's going to lead me down any rabbit holes, or because I don't use it for that. I use YouTube like, I got 10 minutes to kill. Let me watch something stupid. Let me sit here and watch a pool match. That's what I do. But if you're a person that is and I've been that person in the past. It's like got into conspiracy theories, and like, is this real? Like, who built the pyramids? And then next thing you know, you're
how
going
do
down
magnets work?
Right? Yeah, and you're going down this rabbit hole, and then that becomes your fucking life. Like, one of the things that to me was so fascinating about your documentary series was seeing into the lives of these people that were utterly obsessed with these Q drops, and it becomes a thing that gives life meaning when, for lack of better terms, a lot of those folks in that documentary are misfits. Like, a lot of the people are a little goofy. They're the way they talk about things and think about things is a little goofy. And when QAnon came along, it gave them something to latch onto that was bigger than them. They were a part of a movement. And you see that same sort of thinking, that same sort of mental pattern in people that get obsessed with UFOs. You see it in people that get obsessed with political dogma. You see it in a lot of things. They become a part of a movement that's far bigger than them. It's one of the reasons why people get so invested in political candidates and political campaigns. It's not necessarily that they're looking at the big picture objectively and they think that this politician is going to be better for their lives. They're going to highlight problems that we have that are problems that we have with inequality or problems that we have with laws, but mostly they want their team to win. There's a lot of that with a lot of people. They connect ideologically with a team, and then they get very tribal. And that was the thing that I saw in that documentary. I'm like, this is a pattern of human behavior. And it's the QAnon thing just locked into it because it was secretive. It was interesting. The idea that Trump had this insider, this insider was like dropping all this information, that it was all going down. And in Trump, we had this guy that was going to clean up the swamp. He was going to find those people that were eating babies and it was a narrative
that contradicted what people were seeing in the mainstream media as well. And I think that a lot of those individuals who voted for Trump and also gravitated towards QAnon, they wanted to believe that there was this sort of secret story that was happening behind the scenes, where all of these arrests were coming, where what they had hoped would happen would actually happen. And I think that you hit a lot of the big points there, and that's why QAnon is sort of part religion, part political movement, part interactive game. And it draws in people from the UFO crowd. I mean, it's a big tent for all kind of conspiratorial fringe thinking or, sort of strong religious convictions as well. I mean, you see a lot of people who are evangelicals who also believe in QAnon. There's a big overlap there. So I think it's individuals who are looking for community as well, looking for purpose. And I spent so much time with these guys, right? And I would get phone calls in the middle of the night where they just wanted to talk. A lot of times because they just found me to be a grounding force in their lives. And so I would try to always take it when I could and just give them a more neutral perspective versus what they might be hearing, especially some of the Q-tubers.
So some of the Q-tubers, like, they were going down these paths or these, they were in these rabbit holes, and then they would call you and go, hey, man, does this make any sense?
Yeah.
Am I out of line? Because they were wrapped up in it, and they saw you as an objective sort of voice of reason.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, you see in episode 5 one of the craziest things in the series, which is that these ex-Mill guys, whether it's General Flynn or in this case General Paul Vallely or Major General, was he a lieutenant major? Anyway, he's using his ex-Mill guys to seed his political agenda with these Q-tubers. So what happens is they suddenly have someone who is claiming to have this super secret intel reaching out to them and saying, Osama bin Laden's actually still alive. Would you like to talk about that on your QTube station? And they're going, well, and they're useful because someone like in the case of Craig and his site, Just Informed Talk, I mean, he had like 500,000 or more followers. So they're a useful inflection point. So he would be someone who might call me up and be like, what do you think about this? Like, why are they telling me this? What's their motive? Should I tell this to my audience? I'd be like, it didn't really matter what I said. He'd usually just end up telling it to his audience. But, I would try to talk him through it.
Did you try to get a hold of General Kelly?
I did not. The only general that I spoke to, and he didn't end up making an appearance in the series just because I wanted to keep the series focused primarily on the investigation into who was behind it, was General Hayden.
The Kelly one is interesting because when he's standing outside in front of his house with his family, he's like, where we go one, we go all. And they're reading the whole speech, the QAnon speech.
Oh, General Flynn.
I'm sorry.
General Flynn.
I said Kelly. Sorry. Flynn. That was...
So
did you talk to him?
I had tried to get a hold of General Flynn and to do an interview with him. Of course I would have. He was going through some legal troubles at the time. So he was not making as many public statements. He was not really giving interviews. So what you saw was his family, Joe Flynn, Barbara Redgate, I think was her name. Some of these characters who were in his orbit, family members who were kind of speaking on his behalf. Meanwhile, though, General Flynn was messaging Q-tubers behind the scenes, bolstering this. And he had like $5 million in legal bills or some crazy amount of money that he had to spend in his legal bills. So he needed all the support he could get. And I had talked to some individuals who had helped him in his fundraising efforts from nearly the beginning at one of these Q conventions. And they said internally within the family there was debate as to whether or not QAnon was helpful or harmful. But ultimately, they all gravitated towards it.
So do you think he was using it just as a fundraising thing? Like he was attaching himself to that because he knew that they would support his legal defense? Cynically?
I do think that's a part of it, right? You have an incredibly passionate base
right.
who are who see, most of them believed that Flynn was Q. Right, that was the predominant theory among QAnons, because Flynn was so central to the Q narrative. He was a good guy in that narrative, who warranted their support and was kind of working against the cabal. So you ask most QAnons, and Flynn would be very high on their list of suspects for who might be behind it. And it would not be until the last year in the approach to the election that Flynn would openly embrace it, doing what I think you were describing, where he raised his hand with his family on 4th of July, and they all take the Q oath.
Whoa. Yeah, that was wild to see an actual general do that.
And then you saw all of the QAnons doing the same thing. So then they went on YouTube and started taking the same kind of oath. You saw how much power he had really generated vis-a-vis QAnon. What's even more wild, though, is that in Japan, there is a huge crowd that supports Flynn there. So there's like Q Army Flynn Japan. And there's over like 100,000 people in Japan who are like giant Flynn supporters. There's it's almost like a religious offshoot in Japan. There's sort of two different big primary segments there of QAnon, but one of the biggest ones is really centered around Flynn. And that's always shocked me. I mean, imagine if there was like a general in Japan who had a big following in the States. He managed to do that through 4chan or 8chan or 8kun or whatever.
Well, that was another aspect that I thought was odd, is that how people in other countries, like the guy from South Africa, are so into American politics.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard to try to get their perspective. Like, I would imagine that it's just very different being there and looking at us. I think America is such a bizarre anomaly. But
America has so much influence on world policy that if you want to influence world policy, you influence America.
But it is really unusual that we barely know who the fuck the Prime Minister of Canada is. Right? We know very little about Canadian politics.
Yeah, that's true.
We know Trudeau. Right? Handsome guy, see him on TV. A lot of Canadians hate him. That's what we know. I mean, we really don't know anything about all the other people. We knew about that guy. What was his name? The one who was the mayor of Toronto, who was out of his funk, Ford. Remember that guy?
I do remember him. Yeah.
He was crazy.
Yeah, it just requires a big splashy story.
Yeah, so you got to be in the tabloids.
Or something. Something
big has to happen. But that guy in South Africa was fully invested in American politics.
Oh, I mean, living and breathing in it. A huge conspiracy theorist, too. And he's also my sort of prime suspect for the original Q. Really? Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, I don't say it in the series because I couldn't prove it definitively, and I didn't want to. It is possible that I have sort of two other theories for who may have started it, but he's the predominant one.
Well, he was so adamant that the second Q wasn't Q. And I was like, how does he know that? Like, why does he think that? Why is he so convinced? I mean, if he doesn't have access to some data points, if he doesn't have access to whatever it is, like the location or something, the ISP, like what the IP address rather, like what's his reasoning for saying definitively to Ron Watkins, that's not Q?
Right.
What was that?
How does he know?
Right.
How is he so sure?
Right.
Just based on a couple of posts, style, that suddenly Q is posting from a static IP as opposed to a dynamic or changing IP. Mm-hmm. How could he be so sure just based on that? I mean, there's a lot of reasons to think that Paul would have been running it up until that point, and there's a lot of reasons to think why Code Monkey or /Ron Watkins would have taken it from him at that point. I mean, he was posing a real threat to the quote unquote operation. He had just appeared on Alex Jones, so this is late December 2017. Q's been actively posting for about 2 months at this point.
Who had just appeared on Alex Jones? Ron?
So Ron did not appear anywhere. The first recorded interview that I know of that he gave was with me, a year and a half or so, or a year later. this is when Q kind of gets its first. I consider Alex Jones to almost be mainstream. He has a big enough audience, right? You know, it brings it out to a new, bigger audience. It escapes the Chans through Alex Jones, and this happens in late December 2017. And Coleman Rogers and Paul Ferber both appear on his show.
This is when Alex Jones is not banned from social media either.
Correct.
So it's much bigger reach.
Yeah, he's got a bigger reach at this point. So Jerome Corsi, who had been talking about Q drops, sort of famed conspiracy theorist, largely responsible for the whole birther movement thing around Obama, Swift Boat with John Kerry. You know, he's been doing this political operative stuff for years. He brings it to Alex Jones, and Alex Jones brings these two guys on his show, late December. It's Paul Ferber and Coleman Rogers. Coleman Rogers would go on to start a 24-hour news channel devoted to Q. Paul Ferber, was running the board that Q was posting on.
Which is very suspicious.
Very suspicious. For some reason, Q leaves 4chan in late November 2017 and jumps over to chooses Paul Ferber's board on 8chan for some reason. Why? There were many why didn't Q create its own board? Why didn't Q? Why that board?
And was he on Paul Ferber's board on 4chan? Did Paul Ferber have a board on?
No. So Q was largely posting on Poll on 4chan, so they didn't have control.
Poll is a politics.
Yeah, it's like politically incorrect.
Is it POL?
POL. Yeah, and that's where usually Poll on 4chan or 8chan is where you see the most racy kind of anti-Semitic white supremacist stuff. If you're going to see that, it's there, and you can never really tell when you're on that board if people are being ironic or post-ironic or shit posting. Yeah,
right.
You can't really tell. But anyway, that's that's the board that when the Chans get reported on, usually they're pulling screenshots from that. So Q was posting there, and people on 4chan were like, "This is a fucking LARP. Stop it."
What is the first post?
They didn't like Q very much.
They thought it was bullshit.
They thought it was bullshit. Yeah, and in fact, actually, I brought a chart, but you can actually see that Q was the amount of times that people were calling Q a LARP on 4chan was increasing. Almost exponentially at the very end, up until Q decides, I'm out of here. You can see, and then that right at the end there, that's when Q jumps ship and goes over to 8chan. Now, they would also say that Q had been banned on 4chan, and that would also motivated the leap. But I do think that it's interesting that
was it banned on 4chan?
So my understanding is that the trip code itself, like Q was no longer able to post using the trip on
the trip code. Explain that. How
that's a. So it's just a cryptographic function that allows someone to type in a password, a simple password. It's 8 characters long. And they will produce a code, and that's called a trip code. And this is a way of anonymous or pseudo-anonymously kind of identifying yourself. So if I have the password, Q's password, 8-character or so password, type it in, boop, 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 it's going to produce a code. And that code will appear on every post that the password is entered for. So this is how people knew that Q was posting. And in fact, the first 127 posts didn't have a trip code. So there was no way to even know who Q was in the beginning, right? In fact, the Anons had to go back and review all the old posts just to see, like, okay, which ones were Q, which ones weren't. So, like, the first 127 drops, like, anybody could have been coming in, like, LARPing as Q, kind of jumping in, trying to write in this style. Anyone. And the idea of Q hadn't even been established yet. I mean, Q itself, anybody, any asshole on it.
Like you could have done it.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah, you could have done it. Anybody could have done it. Paul Ferber could have been there doing it sometimes, but someone else could jump in, kind of put on the hat. And lots of people were trying to do that in the beginning.
So, like, when you post there, you don't have, like, a screen name?
No, there's no login. So anybody can post without having to log in. That's the that's what makes the Chans really unique. There's also no algorithms on the Chans, but it's if you're using a VPN, which 4chan makes that very difficult. 8chan less so, or 8kun now. If you go there and you want to just shit post and you don't want to have it traced back to you, you can do that. So that's why people, it gives them this true sense of anonymity without having, all of their posts be logged and associated with their IP.
How does that establish a community, though? Because, like, when people have, like, whether it's Twitter or whatever, people find people based on their screen names?
Well, it's more of a culture. And I think that those who are heavy Chan users would the term is fame fagging. That's what they would say, where people use a name like Q to bring more notoriety. You know, they want in their minds like the best ideas rise to the top.
Right.
So they don't want to have the power that's associated with identity. And that's part of why they were so annoyed when Coleman Rogers and Paul Ferber went on the Alex Jones show, because they were, doing what Chan users would call fame fagging at that point. So, and that's a term they love to throw around on the Chans heavily.
So if you had a screen
and Q was doing that too. So Q, by using a trip code, would have been, that term they threw out. But it's when Q started posting, Q was not known as Q at the time. Q was just a random anon writing stuff. And it wasn't until
there was no Q at the end.
No,
of it or
there was nothing. There's no Q at all in the beginning. So that concept wasn't even developed yet, and it was not until drop, I believe, is it 20, 30? It was like I have it. Maybe I brought it with me, but it's like drop. Let me look this up. I don't want to get it wrong. Drop 34. At drop 34, that's the first time we see Q clearance Patriot. And so, some anon just signs off Q clearance Patriot, and the LARP kind of continues. And so it's almost like an improv game where people are jumping in and they're like, oh, what's the story that we're developing? Let me try to add something new to the story. Drop, it's not until drop 61 that you see the idea of Q, signing off as a Q. So the first, 60 or so drops, that's not even a thing. And it's not until drop 128 that Q signs off using a trip code. So at that point, one individual locked it down with a password and then started, writing from there. So it's possible that password could have been shared between multiple people. That was the story that Q told, that there was a whole kind of like less than 10 people who knew the full truth about Q, right? And this was something I'd hear from a lot of QAnons. So yeah, but most likely, if you were just a old school troll on 4chan or 8chan, you would just want it all to yourself. Are you really going to share the password with other people? Because someone else could easily just change the trip code and lock you out.
And they could also reveal that the two of you were in on this together if you have a falling out.
Yeah, and we haven't seen that happen. Nobody has come forth and been like, okay, actually, here's what was going on behind the scenes. Yeah. You would expect there to be some kind of a leak around all of this. And you asked about the community thing. That term I used before, there's tons of terms like that, and a culture that exists on 4chan and 8chan that is very abrasive and is designed to keep normies out. And they try to keep normies out. They want to be as edgy as possible. It's a game of being who can be the most provocative in a lot of instances. So that's largely what drives those communities. And people will have friends on there, and they'll become friends through Discord channels and stuff like that. And sometimes you can have a handle like Code Monkey as a handle, right? People know him as Code Monkey. But the thing about being anonymous is anyone can LARP as you. How do you know if you're talking to the same person or not?
That is crazy, right? So anybody can jump in and pretend to be Code Monkey. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fascinating aspect of this whole thing.
In his case, he has his own trip code, and his trip code produces Ode Monkey.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's actually pretty easy to hack a trip code.
You were with them for how long when you were doing this documentary series?
I was with them, we were filming on and off for about 3 years.
Over the course of that time, like, Ron's story evolves, or either he forgets what he told you initially, or he forgets the way he was sort of describing Q and his idea of politics and what he feels about politics. And towards the end, he's saying essentially he's been educating normies on how to do politics. And you're like, hey, what the fuck? Like, what is this? Like, but along the way, like, part of the thing was analyzing the difference between the original Q and then the Q once it goes to 8chan, right? Mm-hmm. Like, there's a different style of communication.
Yeah. I mean, so the 2 points there. So when we get to the end, we can go into all the reasons that Ron is Q. But if we're just talking about the early days, because I get a lot of people asking me, okay, well, who was the original Q? What you were describing, that style shift, that's a huge indicator, A, that there was only one person writing at one point and then another person writing at the next. And B, it tells us when the shift might have happened. So, that shift that's most detectable is somewhere between the jump from 4chan to 8chan and a little bit after when Paul loses control of the board and believes that Q has become fake. And that's, Q starts posting really, obvious doctored photos. There's, punctuation changes. You can see that it's someone who's trying to emulate.
Punctuation changes?
Yeah, like way more exclamation marks, like just, and stuff, to be clear, it's this kind of punctuation I've seen Ron use on his Telegram feed extensively since he was booted from Twitter in January.
Is he leaning into it?
Well, so after the series concluded, Ron messaged me, and that was the first time he had seen it. He was watching it alongside everybody else. And he messaged me and he said, Cullen, I identify more with villains. He said something to the effect of, I learned a long time ago that you have to make internet personalities larger than life because it makes for a more entertaining existence. I'm not Q, but I may as well lean into it. So he has to continue to deny Q being Q, I think, in his mind, for whatever liability might come with that. It's like he comes as close to admitting it without
there's that moment
fully, without getting rid of the plausible deniability. And I think he also assumes that all of our communications are being monitored.
Right.
So, which they probably are, but
I'm sure they are. 100%. There's that moment where you're both laughing, where he's laughing, where he talks about that he's been doing this 10 years anonymously, but he's not Q. And then you laugh, and then he laughs.
Well, he breaks first.
Right, that's right.
And which is a huge tell as well. Like, he realizes he just fucked up. Like, he realizes he just slipped.
Yeah.
And, and I have, Ron has some tells, he'll clear his throat. That's a big tell for when he's lying. But I mean, that was after 3 years of this kind of cat and mouse thing. And he had always denied being really involved in the boards at all. He would kind of pretend not to know certain things about Q. So this was a big shift for him to come out and say, yeah, actually, like, I was leading digs on the boards, which is basically finding and sort of curating the research or evolving theories or, and this is what happens on Poll. It's what happens on Q Research, is that they're going out and collecting whatever stuff they find on the internet and then, and saying, okay, something about Huma Abedin or something about, nuclear subs. You might just get this sort of lengthy list, and those are the digs. And then they keep getting kind of recycled. And so what Q would really do was just look at all of that research, kind of pick the best, the most spicy stuff, ask a question about it or reference it in some way, shape, or form, and then it would make those who were on those sites feel like they were part of the game, and they go, we're on to something. This insider is looping us in. So to be Q, you didn't need to be a secret government insider. You just needed to know what the Anons were already thinking. You needed to understand that culture, and you needed to spend a lot of time on the boards. You needed to kind of be, well, I was going to say a king of those boards, but just an edgelord to pull it off.
An edgelord, that's hilarious. That's what's interesting, right? It's like you could not be a deep government agent and some person who was in the White House, who had massive responsibilities, who was side by side with the president, and have the knowledge of that community. Really, almost wouldn't be possible.
No, and you would be potentially criminally liable.
Right, like if they went into your White House laptop and go, "Hey, motherfucker, what are you doing on 8chan? Like, what's up with all these frogs with Hitler armbands?" You know, like.
It was like, guys, if you think it's really General Flynn, like, do you think he would tell you?
Right.
Do you think he would at least have like layers and layers between that? Like, the only reason he would lean into it is because it can't come back to haunt him in that same way. And someone like Ron, is what Q did illegal? That's a big question.
Right. Is it incitement?
That's a tough thing to prove.
Right.
But Q pretending to be a government insider or have with Q level clearance. Well, who were you pretending to be?
Well, you're
right?
not only that, you're doing it again on a website that has a lot of frogs with swastikas.
Yeah.
Like what are we supposed to believe that's real? But at a certain point in time, it becomes very clear that there's a massive movement behind this. Like literally millions of people believe this, and some of them don't even go to those websites, correct? Like there's individual websites that collect all of the drops.
Oh,
right?
Sure, yeah. I mean, most of those who were following Q were not actually engaging with the site where Q was posting. That I would say that is
most.
Yeah, the vast majority.
So what
had never
happens?
actually really been to 8chan, and you see that moment in the in the series, right? I talked to Liz Crokin, who was a gossip columnist for the Tribune once upon a time. I think she either wrote for like the Star or the Inquirer, one of those rags as well. But she's like, there's child porn on the sites. Well, that's news to me.
Right.
It's like, well, it gets deleted because 8chan moderates just like every social media company has to moderate. I think they moderate sort of to the absolute limit. But yeah, I mean, she also didn't want to engage with that material. It's an uncomfortable place to be for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So that's part of why in the series I wanted to say, well, look, you need to in order to understand Q, you have to understand the entire mentality of the world from which Q is born. And in fact, the person who is the architect, I believe, behind all of this, and I think we proved to be the architect behind all of this, is, an edgelord of that space. It's the exact kind of person who would run that kind of campaign. And I don't think for a second, like, no one could sit back and be like, I'm going to create this massive global movement and be successful. It's just, this is the one that kind of stuck. I mean, there have been other LARPs in the past, other people who've kind of come out and been these secret Anons. I mean, before Q, there were a couple of other prototypes. I didn't mention this in the series, but, there was like an FBI Anon, I think a CIA Anon, a Mega Anon. And
Mega or MAGA?
Mega
What's
Anon.
Mega Anon?
This is just like someone, in that case, it was supposed to be kind of like someone who had a good insight to Washington D.C. politics and had good sources and was writing on the chans and was supposed to be female. This had happened kind of in the year running up to Q and tailed off at the beginning of 2018. This other kind of heightened Anon. But you can go all the way back to the early 2000s with Art Bell and Coast to Coast. There was somebody who pretended to be a time traveler from the future who was trying to prevent World War III, John Titor.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Tons of people got into it. Were you into it?
No, but that was a fascinating one, the time traveler one. I had a comedian send me this, like he was serious about it. Like, dude, I think this guy's for real. I'm like, do I have to change my number? I think this is a fucking time traveler. But this 8chan thing, what's fascinating to me is how many members does 8chan have, or how many users does 8chan have?
Yeah, there are a lot of. There's what Ron would say, and then there's probably what the sort of truth is. We did some analytics of the traffic, and it certainly went way up thanks to Q. Way more users until Q had become the predominant reason that people were visiting 8chan and 8kun. So we're talking, it looked like over 2 million, were actively engaging there during sort of the peak of Q. It might have been higher than that.
Before
it was
that,
a little difficult because they got wiped from the web, and a lot of the data around, usage got wiped as well. When Q was really booming, right after the Epstein incident, that
this is after Epstein's death.
Yeah. And then there was another shooting, and then that, as you see in the series, kind of triggers a series of events that causes 8chan to get pulled from the web. But
the New Zealand shooting.
So, which one actually?
Was the Christchurch?
It might have been Poway at that point. No, so Poway was in April, and then there was
Poway.
Poway was another. It was a synagogue shooting. So there was Christchurch, and then there was Poway, and then there was another shooting that took place in El Paso in August. There's so many shootings, I can't even keep track of all of them. Which is its own story, I guess. But in 2019. And that it was the third one that became the point that there was a lot of public outcry, largely led by Fred Brannon, their opposition, to wipe the site from the web. And I think the assumption was that people were being radicalized on 8chan, that they were being exposed to dangerous ideas, and that this is what was leading them to these shootings. One of the things I tried to point out actually in the series was that that's kind of a misguided assumption. I think that we can look specifically at the New Zealand shooter, right? Lots of headlines were saying that the New Zealand shooter had done so because they were radicalized on 8chan. But they had, I think they'd visited the Baltics, they donated to white supremacist organizations, and they had, even in their own testimony, said that they'd been radicalized on YouTube, that it was like the YouTube algorithms that had drawn them to a lot of this material once upon a time, years earlier. And so I think that's yet another example where you say, okay, well, algorithms are driving people, in a certain direction. And we can have a conversation about what kind of seatbelts you might want to put on algorithms, but and 8chan doesn't have any, so it was interesting that it was almost like the big tech was passing the buck, that 8chan was the low-hanging fruit, and it's like you get rid of 8chan, you've solved the problem, right? And like in reality, something like Q wouldn't have been successful if it wasn't for big tech. These chans are old, man. They've been around for decades. And Q just escaped the chans, and it escaped the chans thanks to algorithms and people who were susceptible to a narrative that they wanted to believe was true, wanted to be a part of something. I mean, you use the word misfits a lot, and I think that seems applicable in a lot of cases. They're LARPing. Like I made a film about LARPers in 2008.
Did you? What is it?
It's called Monster Camp. Very DIY little film, but it was back before people really knew what LARPing even was. And I saw some parallels here. People who don't have a lot of sort of close friends in their lives and are looking for meaning and want to, I guess, kind of want to feel special. And I think what you see actually over the course of the series, and this is why we structured it this way. I mean, Q did really kind of start as a sort of interactive game that took on a life of its own, and it grew really rapidly until this you could call Q a meme, until it memed itself into reality, until someone like Ron Watkins was advising President Trump near the end of Q and near the end of his term.
Was he really?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't interviewed Trump on this, but I mean, I do know that he was communicating, with Giuliani. He was advising them on what to do in relationship to the election.
How the fuck does that happen?
Trump was retweeting him.
Right, but how does Ron Watkins get a hold of Giuliani? How is he? Why is he taking any advice from him?
He was I asked Ron the same question. This
is true?
Option of last resort.
But this is 100% true?
I mean, I have not talked to Giuliani, but you can see in the data trail, you can see him. Yeah, you can see that Ron was openly advising them on what to do in relationship to the election. He has been an advisor ever since. It blew my mind.
Still right now?
Yeah, he's he was deeply involved with all this stuff with Lindell. He was
Lindell.
Mike Lindell.
What is
the whole symposium, the
MyPillow guy.
Yeah, like the MyPillow guy. Yeah,
the MyPillow guy. That guy. I shut that guy off as soon as I hear him talking. I don't.
The audit, the audit in Arizona. Ron's been advising on that.
Really?
Yeah, he's been.
But did they watch your documentary?
I don't know.
If they watched your documentary, wouldn't they go like, "Hey, what the fuck are we doing? Who are we talking to here?"
Yeah, I mean, I don't.
That's
wild.
I'm not
sure they all saw it.
But that's wild.
But he also still has a huge following, and he was.
So where is he has a following now? He's
and
kicked off of Twitter?
All of this makes you wonder if they had if he had a relationship before he migrated from, Q shuts down right on election day, and then Ron starts actively really posting on Twitter, and the fact that he was able to build such a massive following and quickly start advising on election fraud issues makes you wonder if they had a connection with the administration in some way, shape, or form before that. Ron would often say while I was filming with him that it was a marketing campaign. Some would describe it, which is kind of a glib way of putting
Q
it.
was a marketing campaign?
Yeah, that it would end at the election. He and Jim Watkins, his father, would say that often. A glib way of putting it, but some might describe it as a psyop. And so it is. I consider it a possibility, especially since 8chan was directing a high amount of traffic to Donald Trump's website in the first election cycle. That a relationship had formed somewhere along the way. Maybe there were payments. I don't know. I haven't been able to prove that. But how does someone like Ron Watkins go from, obscurity to suddenly being, a celebrity? In those circles almost overnight, and to being the guy who's like, yeah, I'm reading this election manual. Let me give you some advice on how to do it. I mean, he said it must have just been the option of last resort.
Well, but here's the question: why would they even, if he's not admitting he's Q, all he is a guy who's running 8chan and then 8kun? Why are they even communicating with him? Like, what out of all the human beings in the world? All of the political experts, all of the military experts, all of the people that are, the heads of whatever friendly media organizations that would communicate with him. Why is he communicating with Ron?
Well, I think Q became very useful to the Trump campaign in the last year.
So they knew that he was Q?
Well, I don't know that.
So but why him then?
But we do know that Jason Sullivan, who was Roger Stone's sort of head of social media, was using his algorithm hijacking tools on Twitter to amplify Ron, and he was hoping to get a hold of Q. It is possible that there was that something along those lines was happening behind the scenes there. It may just be the case that Ron was able to leverage his position. And those relationships over time, because he was telling them what they wanted to hear. His lawyers, everybody's saying like, "What are we going to do about this?" And Ron's like, "I've got a plan," right? But it blows my mind to this day. My jaw dropped when I saw Ron appearing on OAN with his black hat on, that he bought when I was filming, a big black cowboy hat, and suddenly he was the election expert, and that suddenly he was advising these guys. That tells you a lot.
OAN is so strange. Whenever I watch, There he is.
There he is. Yeah.
Cyber analyst on Dominion voting. Shocking vulnerabilities. Whenever I watch...
mind you, when I spoke with him after he had been on the air with Chanel Rion on OAN, he's like, well, Q actually did a drop while I was on OAN, so I can't be Q. It's like, the more he tried to make it seem like he wasn't Q, the more he made himself seem like he was. And he had gone through that massive effort to make it seem like Bannon was Q, right?
Right.
A huge effort. I mean,
explain that to people who haven't seen it yet. First of all, go see it. Well, it's on HBO Max. Go watch it, please. It's so good. But
thanks for watching all 6 hours. Too.
Yeah, it's more than that. I watched.
Were you
6
working
hours.
out while you were watching it, or were you?
Some of the time I was actually on the treadmill.
Okay.
Or the stair mill rather, watching, and it kept me distracted. But I watched it again last night. I watched a few of them last night. I watched 2 of them last night.
Oh wow.
Because I just wanted to kind of refresh my brain. The thing that I was getting at initially is like
the Bannon thing. Or
yeah.
We're gonna...
Well, let's just do the Bannon thing, and then I'll get to the thing I was getting at earlier.
Okay.
Where I got distracted. So he sort of tried to. It was very strange that he was doing that. That he was like outing Bannon, right?
Super strange. Why would if Bannon was Q? Why would you dox your most famous user?
Right. And he's saying that what he's using is IP addresses, and then he's isolating it to a very specific location that is very near where Bannon's house is, right?
Correct, yeah. So the very first time I met Ron, we shot an interview in the Philippines. I had gone there saying, primarily I'm interested in looking at free speech through the lens of Q. That's what that was sort of the pretense. And at the end of my interview with him, he pulls me aside and he says, no one's really been looking at this, but I think Bannon is Q. Very first time.
Let's explain Bannon. Steve Bannon. He's Donald Trump's advisor.
Yeah, he was sort of the architect, mastermind behind the 2016 campaign.
There's a lot of people that probably aren't paying attention to politics on this.
Okay.
Okay.
So Steve Bannon.
Okay, so then go ahead. So he pulls you aside.
Who eventually kind of gets booted from Trump's inner circle right before Q gets started.
Yeah.
So
now he's a podcaster.
He's a podcaster. Yeah, he's got his war room or whatever it is.
Yeah, the war room.
I don't know if Ron's appeared on it yet, but
this is the space room.
This is a great room.
Thank you.
Great room. Really, I just want to hover in here. I feel like we should be floating right now.
We can if you want to go there.
Is there time?
There's always time.
Yeah, especially once you've started.
Yeah.
So
Steve Bannon.
So Ron pulls me aside. He's like, "Yeah, it's this guy, Steve Bannon." No one's looked, and I've got my absurd amount of research. I've got an infinity board, thousands of assets. I've got timelines of all the possible suspects for Q at this point. And Bannon was a prime suspect, just sheerly on kind of the circumstances around him, like his character. He knows the Chans, he knows that world, he knows how to co-opt it for political gain. So he makes for a possible suspect. I'm like, well, yeah, I'd been considering Bannon. Now, why would Ron, the very first, first off, trolling journalists, and I don't consider myself a journalist, but trolling journalists is like the gold standard for trolls on the trans. That's, if you can get them to publish something fake, that's their dream, right? So I'm just thinking, okay, well, why is he telling me Bannon the very first time I meet him? Fine. And I say, all right, can you show me some data associated with this? He's like, I'll get around to it, some time goes by, and I think 6 months later he could really tell that the heat was on him. I have Sauron, just Ron. I think that's who it is. He's like, I gotta throw this guy off the trail. He's like, okay, I've got the data. I've got the data that shows that it's Steve Bannon. And you can see in the series in episode 4, he's like, I've known it from the beginning. I've known it's Steve Bannon.
Can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
Why was the heat on Ron at that point?
Well, all of the evidence pointed to him. I had a massive list of evidence pointing to Ron.
And for example?
He would say, while I would be with him, he would say things that, Q's going to start going on the offense. as we're like coming down the mountain. And then during the interview, he brought that up again. Q's going to start going on the offense. 2 days later, Q writes going on the offense. This is not something that Q does often. I think there was one more usage of the word offense in like the thousands of drops that had occurred up until that point. Like that's okay, fine. That's one data point, right? But I have many, many more data points like that. And in fact, actually, Ron, after watching the series and he saw that scene, I was going to get around to this after the whole Bannon bit, but he ended up throwing his own right-hand man under the bus. He's like, well, I had this guy with me that day. He must have been taking notes, and maybe he's Q. He must. That's how it must have. That's the only way that could have happened. All right, fine. Like you've already convinced me of Bannon, but now let's throw your right-hand guy under the bus. But
interesting.
I mean, first off, he would be able to access the trip code. It wouldn't be hard for him to easily hijack it at any point in time.
Could he falsify IP data? Like, how's he getting you this data?
Well, so the data set that he presented, I believe he had been LARPing as Bannon for some time.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
So he had put on the hat of Steve Bannon. I believe probably sometime he was like, who's a likely suspect? He'd done the same thing I did. He was like, who can I pin this on so it wouldn't be traced back to him? And I think when we see that static IP, this is my best guess. What you can do is set up a proxy server. You can just run all your traffic through that one IP address. And so from that point on, that IP address can also serve as a verification method.
And can you make that IP address appear to be in a very specific location?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and Ron would know how to do that, right? So,
right.
If what you want to do is, and that would also make it so that the trip code doesn't end up having to be the primary verification method, and those who run the boards, the admin, obviously the admin, but the moderators and the board owner who can see a bit of the IP address can go, okay, like even though Q has been hijacked, say the trip code's been hacked, well, it's the new IP address. So Q could always use the static IP to fall back on as a verification method. And this is what Paul was complaining about. He's like, okay, well, suddenly Q is using this new IP. Now, interestingly, Ron's right-hand man during one of these other interviews was like, let me show you. Ron was actually messaging me all the way back in early January of 2018 that he thinks it's Steve Bannon. So, and then actually when this takeover, I think, took place, when Paul Ferber, the previous board owner of Q, says that it's a fake Q, some of the first things that get posted are in relationship to Steve Bannon. It's like a Steve Bannon article. So it really looks like right from that moment, someone, most likely Ron, was laying the pipe to create a forensics data set that pointed to Steve Bannon. And I think he was rather disappointed that nobody had picked up on it, And he was like, "Let me show you." And, it's so good. We even staged a whole thing where we sent someone out with cameras in front of Avenatti's office. Shared that stuff. Who lives like 20 minutes or so away from where Steve Bannon's house was. Staged this whole thing so that there was a forensic trail that wasn't pointing in their direction. And that's why it confused the hell out of me. I was like, how, all this data would be such a pain in the ass to fake. Well, it wasn't that the data was fake. It was that the data was designed to look like a certain thing because, of course, Ron would know how to do that. And I'm sure he was just like, he wanted better competition. He wanted somebody to see how smart he was.
God, how much time did you spend thinking about this?
I mean, dude, I spent the last few months just trying to purge my brain of it. I was like, oh, damn it! Now I'm going on Joe Rogan's show. I'm gonna have to re-upload it all. God. Yeah.
So what I wanted to get to before is when the initial Q drops and when all this stuff starts happening, how does it leak and become a mainstream thing? How does it get out? Like, is there a specific moment, or is it just a slow sort of recognition by people who are conspiratorially minded that there's this gentleman or person or whatever that's pretending to be this Trump insider? Like, what is it that makes it become this huge thing? I don't remember when I started hearing about it, but I assume by the time stuff reaches me, it's leaked out into the mainstream.
Yeah.
So what What was the event?
People started talking about this anonymous insider on the chans almost immediately. It was almost instantaneous. And I think that for those who were trying to get an edge on YouTube, having this, being able to say like, oh, there's this secret government insider who's releasing drops and all of our dreams are coming true. So you had people like Tracy Beans, Jordan Sather, right from the start, kind of being like, is this legit? Here's what they're saying, and then it kind of built from there. People are following them, start checking out, the chans. But it was still fairly contained. It was fairly contained up until like late December of 2017, when these characters, Tracy Beans, Paul Ferber, and Coleman Rogers, and I believe it was Tracy's idea, say, let's start a board on Reddit that's devoted to QAnon. That's going to reach, a much wider audience. And it certainly did. 2017, yeah.
So Reddit is where it branches out.
Reddit branches out, and then it also branches out when they go on the Alex Jones show, and that becomes a big boom.
So then it becomes fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's when the excitement kind of kicks up. But you had a lot of the Anons who were pissed off that they had gone on Alex Jones, that they were going mainstream. They wanted
everybody to stay anonymous,
and they didn't like the celebrity status of it. Yeah,
that's fascinating.
Here's
fascinating part of the culture, right?
So really fascinating, and you can see it even in Q's mentality towards Tracy, because so this is great. I talked with all of the board owners for Q. So everybody who had ever been in charge of the like craziest thing on the internet that's QAnon, right? Like where Q had been posting on their board. I asked them all like, okay, well, did Q ever communicate with you, right? Did Q ever, send you messages? And they said, well, not like direct messages, but Q, because of that IP address, would sometimes post anonymously, openly on the boards, so that only the board owner or the moderators would know it was Q. So it was a way of communicating with those who were running the boards without the entire public knowing it. And so they would be able to just go, okay, same IP, bring it up. And there was one Q didn't do this very often, very, very rarely. But one of the board owners was like, there's a really unbelievable moment. Like my jaw just dropped that Q was saying this stuff, and I was on this call with like a couple of other, folks who were big into Q at the time. I think anyway, they were all like, wait, what is it? What is it? I think we have it's like secret Q drop. But
secret.
Oh, this is great because Q is just shit talking Tracy Beans and some of just writing like a trash talking Anon.
And so this was after the switch to 8chan?
Yeah. So this is April. I believe it was from April of 2018, and Q, people are really starting to monetize Q at this point. Tracy Beans is kind of moving away. She's built this huge audience off of QAnon. She's kind of rejecting it. And Q, if we scroll up, you can
R
see
equals 18.
So you can see the ID right there, the FC whatever. This is something that only a board owner or a moderator would be able to see. It's right next to anonymous. So then you see that little like FCFE3I. Yes. So if you scroll up and you can see a Q drop, that one right there, it has the same ID next to it, the FCF, and that's because it's like the representation of the like a hash representation of the IP address. So it's the same. So that Q, even though they didn't use the trip code, was also posting these anonymous drops. So and we didn't include this in the series, but this is kind of wild that Q was actually making posts that, as those who were running the boards could actually see. So you have this one here, R equals 18.
Why is that interesting? Why is that unusual that he's making?
Well, because he's secretly communicating with the board owners, and only they would be able to, and moderators, and they'd be able to see it. But if you scroll down,
so this is only to moderators.
Yeah, so messages. You can see. Well, the ones that have Q were public, and everybody would know. The ones that are anonymous, no one knows that these are actually Q posting, except for the moderators. So you can see there, it says Beans.
Hey, patrons.
No, up above that, it says Beans, you are shit.
Yeah.
That's Q writing.
Yeah, interesting. That doesn't seem like it makes any sense.
Then you go down here, it's like, help me change the world, not us, but her. Scam, scam, scam. What a disgrace. So this is Q being very upset at Tracy Beans for monetizing Q. For pivoting mainstream,
and that's her YouTube channel. Like what it says fake outlets like CNN, New York Times. So that's what it is. Like going on those outlets and then promoting her YouTube channel. Is that what it is?
Promoting her YouTube channel, trying to get people to give her money. Basically, you can see here, Bean started at 8K followers, now 77K because of Q. This is Q writing. Mm-hmm. Now pushing for more money, and the drops Q now pushing for the money and drops Q to be more accepted mainstream.
Huh.
So Q is like she got famous off of Q and now is dropping Q, and Q is not happy with this.
This is someone upset that someone's getting famous. Someone's riding it out.
Well, but this is Q writing it.
Right, a lot, yeah.
Whoever, which was likely Ron at this point writing this.
Which seems like, this is not like, why the fuck would a government insider give a shit who's becoming famous from distributing what's supposed to be real information, right?
Yeah.
Like
and just coming on here and just writing like a typical anon, just like shit posting and bitching.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
It's like when Q was like writing to the border, he's just like another anon.
How many people at one point in time were doing Q-related YouTube videos?
I don't a lot, lot where there were, I think 15 or 20, who were like the predominant ones, and maybe like 10 really big ones, big accounts. And we follow a couple of them in the series. Craig had a huge following. Liz had a huge following. Dustin had a sizable following. Jordan Sather had a really big following, and they kind of came at it from different angles. Like Craig was the evangelical approach. Dustin was more of the truther. Who kind of went after everybody.
Craig is the guy who had Donald Trump on his wall.
Yeah. And then you have someone like Jordan Sather who comes from the like David Wilcock, UFO, like New Age crowd, like the reptile people, lizard people, or whatever, blue avians. That's his
5G
baby kind of their thing. So you could and so for them it was like, okay, well here's a whole new audience that maybe we can tap into, and as Q became this umbrella for all beliefs, all conspiracies, the big tent. It was very useful for, say, someone like Wilcock or Jordan Sather to be like, okay, well let's inject our worldview into the broader narrative. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about Q is that, Q didn't have complete control, right? It was kind of call and response. Like, what does the audience want to some extent? And because it was an evolving narrative. And the idea that lizard people or blue avians got introduced to a subset of that, subset of that ecosystem isn't something that was introduced by Q itself. It was just something that others who glommed onto it introduced. So, I don't know. That's it. It's kind of fascinating to watch how it took on a life of its own, and in some ways, Q didn't have quite as much control as you might imagine. I mean, Q even did Q&As at one point, where people would ask.
Really?
Yeah. People would ask a question, and then Q would be like, "Well, 9/11 not an inside job. Aliens real. Those kind of things. Earth is not flat." Right?
How does he have time for this?
I mean, if you go to Ron's Telegram, look at how much he's been posting every day.
If it's Ron.
If it's
you're convinced.
I'm convinced.
100%?
100%.
Wow.
I mean, I'm not convinced that Ron was doing it entirely autonomously. He had support. There were overlapping networks that made this possible. But was Ron, the linchpin of it all? Did he have control of the Q account? That I believe 100%.
It seems like it because the shift from 8chan, when 8chan was taken down, and then they come back as 8kun, and then Q starts posting before anybody can post.
Oh,
I mean, duh.
Right?
I mean, that's a big duh, right?
That's another huge one, yeah.
That's a giant duh. Like, hey, fuckface, how dumb do you think we are? Right? Like, that's like... No one else has the ability to post, and you don't know who Q is, and you're not in direct communication with Q, but Q posts. Okay.
Somehow
Okay.
no one else was able to do it, really. But
Right.
like, I was sitting there trying. He's like, well, Q must, Q has high-end military. Who knows how he was able to do it? Just like, how did Q know? How did Q know how many users were on 8chan, posting? He's like, I don't even know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Boy.
I mean, that was a huge tell. I mean, there were like lots of little clues I wasn't able to include as well. Like, I went through and like analyzed reflections in some of the photos, that showed like how Q was holding the phone when they were taking pictures, and it was like left-handed. Oh. And both Jim and I wrote about this on Twitter, and then Ron, messaged me. He's like, "Well, I'm ambidextrous, so."
Oh God, Jim is a character. Jim is a fascinating person. Like I don't know anyone like that guy. Watching that guy just talk and communicate, and watching his mannerisms, and how old is he?
Oh, I don't know his age off the top of my head. Mid-50s.
He looks a lot older, right?
He does. He looks like a man who's lived.
Yeah, like he's had a hard life, but it's the way he's communicating. It's like he's playing all the time. Like everything's playing. It's very playful when he's talking to you and he's explaining things. Everything. He's got an incredible sense of awareness of how he's being perceived and the what he's projecting. Like I'm watching the way he's talking, and I'm like, this guy. This is not like This is not his first dance. You know what I'm saying? Like, he knows how to talk to people. Like, it's like...
Well, he was a recruiter in the military. So he did that for a long time before. So he knew how to convince somebody to, pick up a gun.
Yeah.
And so he has the gift of gab, and, that requires some pretty solid communication skills, I think.
But it's interesting that that's lost when you communicate in text. Like what's interesting about him is when he talks and you can see him, and you get the whole big picture of who he is, this oddball character. In the end, he's got the crazy facial hair and all that jazz. But all of his weird quirks, all the weird things about him. Like, the guy should have a fucking podcast. I don't know if he does.
I mean, he YouTubes regularly.
Does he?
I mean, or bit shoots, or he has his own thing. Like,
are you allowed? Is he allowed to be on YouTube?
I don't think. I mean, I'm not sure if he's on YouTube anymore. He created his own version of YouTube.
He did?
Yeah.
He created it?
Yeah, it's called. Well, it's not quite YouTube, but it's
what is it?
Tiger Network is the name of it.
Tiger Network.
Yeah.
See if he's on YouTube. But I mean, while I'm watching it, I'm listening to him talk. I'm like.
Well, remember, it's edited,
guy.
so it's you're cutting out all of the stuff
Nonsense.
that's not that compelling.
I understand, but what I'm saying is, it's like he's really aware of how he's being seen.
He is, and I think that playfulness is very intentional,
yes.
and it masks something more sinister in a lot of cases. And you see that on the 6th, right? On when we're approaching the Capitol, you see that kind of crack. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you see when you see the whole 6th thing with him?
I mean, he's a little in the approach to that. He's almost starry-eyed, like he's looking around and going. I mean, he says it, right? He's like, "This is the most non-business thing I've ever done."
Right.
And I think it drained him financially, keeping Q online. In the long run, he had to sell his pig farm.
How did it drain him financially? Like, what was the hit?
Well, it was expensive to keep 8chan online, for one.
Expensive to run?
Mm-hmm. It's, as they describe, it's a yacht, that you just sink money into. Mm-hmm. And Fred Brennan, their opposition, who had created 8chan, made it difficult to keep it going. Made it expensive legally and technically for them. they had a lot of legal costs associated with all of that. I don't know. They had to change locations for their businesses. They had to change server setups. I mean, he just made things more costly, and Jim or Tom, I guess, said that Jim is somebody who, when he gets money, he kind of spends it. So he sometimes he has a lot, and sometimes he doesn't have very much. Fred would say that that's all bullshit and that Jim is actually super wealthy and it's all just a character he's playing, because they have 5 Channel in Japan, which is an incredibly popular chan. That's, I think, where the majority of their income stream comes from. And you see some of that Chan drama play out where, he had this split with his old business partner, Hiroyuki. He's super famous in Japan. Might also explain why there's the whole Q Japan Flynn thing we were talking about earlier, because they have headquarters there. So if they're going to get Q to be popular anywhere, it's going to probably be in Japan. And Chan culture is also much bigger in Japan, I guess, in part because if I was to guess, or I've sort of heard that when you're in an environment where you feel like you're socially not as free, you need more outlets, and the Chans serve as that outlet. And
the Chans in Japan, are they in Japanese characters?
They are, yeah.
And can you translate it? Is it translatable? Like, is there a button that you can hit or anything?
I don't think it's quite that convenient. It's not not like on Twitter where you translate tweets.
So my point was it's all Japanese traffic, essentially.
Yeah, Japanese traffic, and it makes it really hard to really know how it's what's going on in Japan. And if you want to have your business operations somewhere, it's difficult to do research. I mean, we just released the series in Japan, with a Japanese dub and everything. So I'm very interested to see how it's received there. And that's where Ron is still. I mean, we never that end sequence where I sort of confront him on why I think he might be Q, and he kind of comes out with it. Initially, we were supposed to meet again to film, and I wanted to kind of confront him on sort of the list of reasons I thought he was Q. And he wanted to do it on an ice wall, so like ice climbing. And he had just gone on one ice climbing trip.
He apparently has a YouTube channel where he talks about God and sings hymns.
What?
That sounds about right.
Yeah, it's unrelated to all of his other stuff.
Oh my God.
There's only one video on it right now, and that's it.
Just one.
Things might have gotten deleted.
Oh, I mean, this is what he'll
he calls him Watkins Xerxes.
That's how I had to find it. It wasn't
Jesus
coming up just looking up
Christ.
his name.
Yeah. Solid.
And he's in the Philippines still?
No, he's in California.
Really? Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. He moved to California. Why did he have to do that again?
I think that... I mean, I usually try to keep people's families out of it, but it was a family reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the January 6th thing again. You were saying that you see more of a sinister aspect of his personality on the January 6th thing. Like what do you mean by that? Other than the fact that he said it's the most.
Well, you can see a fire in his eyes. Right.
But don't you think that that's also just the moment itself? Before anyone attacks the Capitol building itself, you're there in this wild, crazy mass of humans. Have you ever been to
But I mean, I had seen that look in his eyes before. That wasn't the first time. It was
when had you seen that before?
When I would bring up Fred.
Do we get upset?
Mm-hmm. I think the first time that when he had to go and confront Congress, he was obviously pretty riled up about that. I mean, he's used to being the boss in the Philippines, so being in a situation where he maybe had less power, and he would even tell you that he's, he can be volatile. And the first day we met or filmed with him, at the end of that day, he said to me, "You're the enemy, right?" And I was like, I don't think I'm your enemy.
Well, if you were the enemy, why is he talking to you? It's voluntary, right? The whole thing was voluntary. Like, why did they agree to do that? Did they think that they were smarter than you? They were going to be able to, keep shucking and jiving to the very end, and at the end of it, you would think it was Steve Bannon or whoever?
I mean, in the beginning, I had first reached out to Fred, and I didn't know that their relationship was dissolving, that the tension was growing between Fred and Jim and Ron. And I was genuinely interested in the free speech side of what HM was doing, and I didn't think that they were behind Q when I went there. I just went to talk to them also in part because if anybody knew who was behind Q, it would be those with the technical data. Everything else is just can be noise. You can sort of see what you want in the writing, but the data itself was sort of the most valuable. Of course, after I left, I was like, oh, God, these guys are suspicious.
Right away.
Oh, right. I mean, as I was doing those interviews, I was like, what is going on?
You know what got me? The tape on the glasses. I was like, motherfucker. You got an expensive watch on and you got tape on your glasses. Like, what's going on?
You know, Ron reacted to that, right?
What?
He's like, it was dental floss.
Reacted to what? Me?
You.
Really?
Yeah.
Dental floss.
Yeah, he was using dental floss instead of tape.
That's what it was?
Yeah, I guess so.
Why didn't you just buy a new pair of glasses?
Well, look, I think I even told him this. I was like, I think it's just part of the character you were playing, right? Like,
yeah, that's what I thought.
Oh, I have a bunch of comments from his Telegram in relationship to it. If you want to look at them,
no, I don't.
Probably not.
Was he upset about it?
I mean, he was just being a little sassy about it. That's all. Sassy. He was just like an opportunity to be like, actually, it was dental floss.
Well, whatever the fuck it was.
But it's part. I think
it's so on the nose.
It's just a character Ron's playing. Ron is a theater nerd. He's a huge theater nerd. Like I played sports, but I was also a theater nerd. And so
you know both worlds? I
know both worlds, yeah. I mean, I definitely know the type. Though Ron just takes things to the extreme more than anyone I've ever met. We've discovered when we were going to Reno that we had both been in the Music Man and both been in the Barbershop Quartet and both still remembered the music to it. So Ron has this idea that like we're all, the old Shakespeare thing, like we're all just actors on a stage, But then the question is like, what part do you want to play if that's true? And he seems to like that villain role. Mm-hmm. He's drawn more to that. And I think that the glasses are just a character. I mean, the watch, he was covering up his watches. These fancy watches, and when he stopped covering it up is when we were in Reno filming, and then he like kind of rolled it up to show me that he was now wearing a Casio watch. And I went back and looked through all the footage, just like, okay, like, did he have on fancy watches? Because Q would use fancy watches to confirm, still in fact Q, and fountain pens, yeah. And that was a good red herring for a bit, because I was just like, well, and maybe Jim was also in on it or got in on it at some point, right?
Because he's really into pens.
He's super into pens. I mean, as Ron would say, he's like autistic about pens would be Ron's definition of it, but Ron's into them too. He kind of let that slip at one point. Where
he's also into pens?
Yeah, he's like, oh, I tried to buy this $3,000 pen and I couldn't get it. And you can hear it. It's in one of the scenes in Reno. But Ron's also, super into fountain pens, just not as obsessed with them.
What a bizarre thing to get into, pens.
Yeah.
Do they write a lot?
But you can see, this is all for show, right? So that like he puts on the Casio watch. He's thinking very much about the image he's presenting and how it's going to be interpreted. Yeah. Even the green hat. Uh-huh. That. Do you know what the green hat means in China?
No.
It means you're a cuck.
Really?
Yeah. So you've been made a cuckold of.
Cuckold dove?
Yeah.
Oh, I never heard that term.
Or maybe I'm using it wrong.
I like
Made it.
If you invented it, congratulations. It's a good one.
Here we go. But
cuckold dove is fun. Have you heard of cuckold dove? Nope. Jamie's pretty deep on the internet.
Well, then I
might have invented a new term. That?
Well, no, like you've been made a cuckold of, like
cuckold of.
Like two separate words.
Well, I think you just inadvertently made a good word. Cuckold dove.
Cuckold dove.
Cuckold dove is nice.
Oh, like a dove.
Like a pair of them?
Yeah, like a cuckold dove. Like you're like a little peaceful cuck.
Like the third day of Christmas. My true love gave to me.
I mean, dove is the peace bird, right? Yeah, you're a cuckold dove. I like it.
But yeah, that's you wear that green hat around China, and women will approach you, and this is why he wears it.
They will approach you and do what?
Be like, you know what that green hat means. So it's a pickup trick.
What kind of?
And also he's leaning into the cuck aspect.
Was it a baseball
culture.
hat?
It's just like a big green. It's kind of a baseball hat.
I'm trying to remember.
It's like a baseball hat.
Okay, so that's why he wears that hat.
Yeah.
So he's very conscious of his image.
Mm-hmm.
The whole martial arts thing was odd too. When I'm watching him like punch the makiwara and all that jazz.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't look like he does that a lot. You know what I'm saying?
I don't. I'm not a martial arts expert, so
it's very performative. It seemed very performative because like I'm watching him throw the punches, and they're not efficient. It's not like a guy who has done that a lot. Like have you watched video footage of someone hitting a makiwara? Like people who do that on a daily basis.
I did not side by side them, no. But
no, you don't need to.
Is it just?
He just seems like a guy who's like maybe he's done it a few times, but he's making it seem like this is like a common aspect of his day. This practice,
right? Well, he exaggerates everything.
Yeah.
So, like he recently on his Telegram, he's like, I do ice climbing. I'm an ice climber, and then he like posted images from the only time I know he's ever done ice climbing. So I imagine it might be similar with the martial arts thing, where
Well, if you do martial arts a couple times, you're technically a martial art. Like I play basketball with my kids sometimes. I am not a basketball player, but I guess I could say I play basketball.
Ron, right? Ron does a lot of things. He's a jack of all trades. He said. After Q stopped posting and he stopped being the admin of 8kun, right around at the same time, he's like, I'm going to be a woodworker now. I'm going to start making crafts. I'm leaving 8kun behind to become a woodworker. He actually posted this really absurd video where he went out into the woods and kind of this happened out like maybe a month or two after the series aired, and it was like, here's my new character that I'm playing, and I'm leaving the old Q thing behind. I think I have the video here. It's sort of like it feels like he's playing to the ASMR crowd a little bit, and he dubbed the whole thing. It's very
the ASMR crowd is strange.
Weird.
It's strange, but it's really compelling. Some of it's very compelling. Like there's one guy, I go to his channel, and he cooks out in the woods. And he chops the wood, and he makes the fire, and there's no conversation at all. It's crackling, and then he's eating the food. And it's like, video might be 30 minutes long, and it's got millions of views. Like, this is wild. Like, people are really into just, like, listening and watching people do stuff where they don't talk.
Do you want to listen to Ron, when you
I don't know.
Put your head on your pillow at night? You're like, maybe just Ron's voice lulling me to sleep.
Well, that's not necessarily ASMR, right?
If you heard the way he did it,
okay.
It very much feels it feels like he was going for the ASMR crowd. Just
it's
a little bit.
He, like his dad, they're clever. And it's funny how playful it's like an internet person out in the world sort of interacting. We'll hear this.
I don't know if that's it. It's one thing. Okay.
This is the end of it, I think.
Leaving 8kun, I have hand-built many wooden toys. Donating to children and orphanages throughout my region of the world.
Going to be some dead spots.
This is fascinating.
That being said, I am no longer affiliated with 8kun and have no interest discussing 8kun or Q-related material. I have always been opposed to violent criminal acts in the name of any group.
This guy's weird. Fucking master. He's a master. Master troll. Master troll.
I do believe strongly in the fundamental right to legally express our beliefs and ideas in ways protected by the Constitution.
Is he speaking in Japanese
regardless
and then dubbing it in English?
Acceptance.
Yeah. Just wait for the last bit here. Watch this.
I am not Q and have never posted as Q.
But
what the fuck? Oh my god!
He ducks his head and he puts on a black hat.
Down.
He's just like never posted as Q. I mean, the whole thing is just like a.
It's great. It's great. I mean, it's very entertaining. It's very fun.
Shitting in the town square. Like that's why I included.
That's shitting in the town square.
Kind of, yeah. Like it's because he's just messing with people. Like he's hijacking culture to get us talking about it, to get.
But
people...
is that what he's doing, or is he just having fun?
I mean, it's kind of having fun.
That seems like fun to me. I mean, look.
But also when he takes his black hat and goes, I've never posted as Q, and then looks away from the camera. It's super performative.
But it's also the weirdness of the dubbing. Like, what is that? What's the original? Is it originally in Japanese?
I mean, Ron would never. It's like he would always do a funny walk, I have no idea if he even said the same things. He probably just went out, recorded himself, came back in, and was like, all right, I'm going to, read my script now.
But he's talking in the thing, and it doesn't match up.
Yeah. He did not. I brought that up. He didn't worry about that.
I think he did it on purpose.
Oh, he definitely did
for
it on
fun.
Purpose, just to make it as weird as possible.
Exactly.
But
why do you say that it's like hijacking?
Well, the idea is like to. So the reason I included the Diogenes bit in one of the episodes is because I felt it was the most illustrative of Ron's worldview.
What is it? What was the Diogenes?
It's the cynic. So cynicism. And this is something that Ron had brought up along the way. This idea that like a dog can shit in the middle of the town square, why can't I?
Okay.
So it is super performative. And I think what he's leaning into assumptions and trying to and I mean, you could also just call Diogenes a troll.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the same thing. It's like, why can't I do this thing? It gets people talking about oh, look at that guy. He just took a shit in the middle of a town square. Who does he think he is? That's so, And I think that really helps explain how Ron sees the world. He's and partially treating it like it's a game, but if he has any religion, I would say it's that flavor of cynicism. It's like Socrates gone mad.
I don't know, man. That's funny to me.
Oh, it's funny. I mean, that's why I brought it here, because I thought it was like,
it's hilarious.
It's super weird and like kind of hilarious. And
I do not dislike them at all. I mean, I don't. Part of me with all this kind of QAnon stuff is like, and many things online. And it gets into this conversation of censorship and whether or not censorship is necessary or whether it's evil or whatever. The thing about it is all these things is that doesn't work on me in terms of like the Q drops and all that stuff. I never got interested, right? So I never got invested in it. I got invested, but in the way that I wanted to figure out who was behind it. You're making a documentary.
A different flavor of obsession.
So it's like...
But I mean, Ron is fucking with misfits. If you look at what he's done in recent... I mean, look, like I think you can find likable things about anybody. And I think that if you look at what Ron's been doing since Q sort of stopped and what he's been up to on Telegram... I mean, he's been running these same kind of like hype trains to get people really excited that something is going to happen and that it doesn't. I think the most insane one, though, that has happened in recent times, he got this, woman who was working in an election office in Colorado to she sent him some documents that he started trumping up this idea that there was this whistleblower, this Dominion whistleblower, was going to be the end all be all. That they had, she had revealed the passwords to the system, and this was going to blow open the whole thing. He gets tons of new followers on Telegram. He's saying he's telling people spread the video, spread it far and wide. This person's a hero. And he releases this video, and people immediately start going like, wait, this isn't any, we already knew all of this stuff. And people started reporting that it had come with malware. So like basically it's
the
a spread.
video?
Yeah, and they started showing their calendars that were full of like virus notifications. Things couldn't be shared. So it sounds like he told people to spread this video far and wide, and it was laden with malware.
And what was the malware attempting to do?
I don't actually know what the malware. Probably create a botnet, something like that.
So do you think
might have been a prototype?
He released the malware?
So you can see this is what people were showing on their.
Click down to protect your priceless data. Oh my God. And this is a Google Calendar? Is that what that is?
This is an iCalendar, I think, like someone's iPhone.
Wow.
So lots of people were saying this. And then it gets even crazier because Lindell has this whole cyber symposium. They're going to reveal that the whole election was a fraud. They bring the whistleblower out. And what happened is Ron essentially doxed her when he released the information, even though he said that he was like scrubbing everything. He released some passwords that got traced back to her, and now she's like entangled in a big, legal suit. But essentially, she ended up doing the thing that she had claimed the other side was doing. She somehow got access to the password that the Secretary of State, I think, was supposed to be the government was only supposed to be the ones who had access to this. And then she ended up releasing it. So it's a huge like legal problem for her. Ron didn't really protect her in that situation. And it's created chaos. So talk about fucking with misfits.
Wow.
Like it's just
is it possible that he didn't know about the malware?
No, because he cut the video. He put it together and then he released it.
Are you saying that his video purposely had malware in it?
That is what it would. That is the indication. Yes, based on all of the comments after the video got released from people who had been following his Telegram from some time. Like, this thing's full of malware.
Why the fuck would someone do that though? It seems like it would be so obvious that that's what.
Well, maybe he didn't know what the outcome would be. Could have been a prototype. I don't know why he would bother doing something like that. But again, like he is someone who, go back to the Diogenes thing. I think for him, all of this is just entertainment.
So even releasing malware would be fun. Like, haha, I got everybody to click this video. It's all shit you already knew, and now you have malware on your computer.
Q is malware. It's like it's releasing a lot of like ideological or conceptual viruses into people's minds and getting them to believe that like all these arrests were going to happen that never happened.
Educate me on Telegram, because I know very, very little about it. I've never been on Telegram. Is it essentially for people that got banned from other social media platforms or that feel like they're being censored?
Yeah, it's an encrypted platform.
Is it all right-wing?
Doesn't use algorithms. No, it's a messaging. It's a messaging platform.
Oh, so it's not like a Twitter.
No, it's not quite like a Twitter.
So how the hell do you
You can just follow people on there. So it's it started as a messaging platform, but you can have gigantic groups. And the guy who started it, I think he used to, and this is a little outside of my expertise. He was, I believe, he's Russian. He had, I think maybe he'd worked at Kontaktia before. He left, started Telegram. Russia, not his biggest fan. They raised a bunch of money in some crypto ICO. I think it's probably helped their technology to scale. And they are, far more permissive when it comes to people using their platforms. Technically, unless you're a member of the group, you shouldn't be able to see what people are posting. But you can forward messages now from, what one person wrote to another group. You can follow people on there. And so Ron has actually managed to accrue hundreds of thousands of followers. I think he's over 430,000 followers at this point on Telegram, where he can post something and share it, and then people can just comment in the aftermath. And there is a kind of retweet functionality in the form of forwarding messages, but it doesn't have the same kind of amplification tools built into it. So it's just
because there's no algorithm.
Yeah.
But so is it like Twitter, where you could just I could follow you on Twitter and I can go say, oh, what's he up to? And then click on it and then see all of your tweets?
Yeah. You can go back and see everything Ron's done, or anybody who has a Telegram feed has done, unless they've deleted it.
So it's a messaging app, but it's also like a social media app as well?
I think it's evolving into a social media app.
So okay. So it was initially just like Signal?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I had used it initially. And then I was surprised to hear, oh, wait, it had been sort of retooled to be, to followed, but to create sort of big followings on there.
And how does someone become aware of it? Is it just word of mouth in terms of like following people and things along those lines?
You can say, follow this person. So if you have a big Telegram account, you can forward somebody else's message or say like, hey, here's another handle. Follow this person. Mm-hmm. I'm not the foremost expert on Telegram, so I may not know exactly what its origin was, but I do remember that initially I was using it primarily as an encrypted messaging tool, then pretty quickly several years ago. Crypto groups, other things were using that as a means for communicating with a large audience.
So it's not essentially designed as like a Twitter replacement, but it's being morphed into something along those lines.
It's being utilized in a similar, but I think better way for society. I think the fact that it doesn't have algorithms makes it and the fact that it's encrypted and that the company itself isn't mining your data, and that's not I don't know what their business model is, but maybe they don't know yet. But.
Right. Well, didn't Twitter lose massive amounts of money for a long time? Like they weren't making any money, right? But they were worth a lot of money on paper because
users are valuable.
Yeah, but they didn't exactly. I don't know. Maybe they know how to monetize it now, right? But for the longest time,
yeah. I mean, once they went public and then kind of figured out how to use the conversations that were happening, have people pay for to get stuff trending and have ads served.
What is the replacement for Twitter? Like when people get kicked off of Twitter, what is the standard? Where's the standard place that they go?
I mean, there's a lot of companies that are trying to be the replacement. I don't think any have really stood out. I think Telegram is winning at this point. Because it is a little evolved compared to like a Gab or something along those lines.
Okay,
Gab was one of the things
right?
that had really picked up, but Telegram just has better technology too. I mean, the fact that it is encrypted makes it an improvement. It's not mining user data in the same way. So,
how many users does Gab have? Do you know?
I don't know. No,
but is
that
that became popular for quite a few people that did get banned from social media platforms, right?
Yes. So I think, Ron and Andrew Torba, I believe, is the CEO of that company. And Ron had an account there. I think they had some kind of data leak that was problematic for them. But
that Ron had a data leak?
Well, not Ron had a data leak, but the Gab had a data leak.
Oh.
That was problematic for them.
And then there's Minds too, right?
There's a bunch of these
free speech platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, they say that they're, but what do we even mean when we say that, right? Because, I think one of the things that people misunderstand about Section 230 is that what it does is it protects companies who want to moderate.
Explain Section 230.
So Section 230 is this. It's this part of the Communication and Decency Act that many people in the digital rights space would say, it sort of created the internet. In some ways, it is the First Amendment of the internet, in that it allows companies to foster speech on their platforms in line with the First Amendment or not. It can either be as permissive as you want it to be, or you can moderate as much as you want. And in fact, there was a court case early on that is what led to this, where I think it was Prodigy was being sued for something that someone had posted on their site, and then they started moderating, and this is when they determined that actually, you can moderate but not be responsible for the content that's being published there. And so this is what allows comment sections, is what allows for social media to exist. It really is the thing that drives the internet. And a lot of times people will say, well, this is a handout to big tech, which isn't quite accurate either. It's really the thing that allows small companies to survive as well. Any kind of competition would rely on the fact that people can post stuff on their platform and that they're not going to be liable for that. Now, if they write their own things on the platform, I think roommates.com got in trouble for something that they a kind of bias that they had built into their engine itself. Then they can get in trouble. But if we got rid of Section 230, which I've heard, people say, well, if I can't say whatever I want on Twitter, let's get rid of Section 230. It's like, well, do you think that these companies are going to be more or less permissive if they're liable for every single thing that's there? And really what's going to happen, what some of these bigger companies are going to drive towards, is using AI moderation that only they can afford. And when something goes wrong, they're just going to blame, say bad AI, right? And then meanwhile, competition, smaller companies that can't afford that moderation will simply be edged out. So if Twitter was somehow liable for everything that was on the site, they would probably integrate a lot of this AI moderation tools. And we've seen how well that works.
Right.
It's not particularly good at determining what should or should not be allowed online, and it ends up casting a far wider net.
Yeah.
I don't. That doesn't seem to be the solution here. But I do think that we have a challenge, given the scale of these companies. How many people use Twitter? How many people use Facebook? When they become the arbiters of truth and are the primary place that many people are getting their information from, where news is being created, I think we do have to ask the question: well, should there be rules in place that require them to treat content more neutrally, or do we want them to operate as autonomous businesses, even at that scale, that can dictate what people see and what they don't? We've just never seen anything in our lives where hundreds of millions of people were using the same thing, and there was an entity that could determine what should be allowed. And you could make the public square argument around that as well and say, like, so many people are using it that this has become a kind of digital public square. But as the law currently stands, it's a private company. It can do what it wants.
What are your thoughts on this? Like, especially because you're so deeply invested in this Q phenomenon, we see how that went. I mean, if you ever really wanted to suppress free speech, what you would do is engineer something like Q and then have it reach this boiling point, which is January 6th, where you have an arguable point, if you wanted to say, this is what we want to avoid, and this is why we need at least some form of censorship.
I mean, I think that, and this is what drew me to the story in the beginning, Q is testing the limits of free speech. Right. And that's kind of how you know whether or not you have a right, whether or not you can have dangerous ideas, whether or not you can say unpopular things. And that's why I was drawn to Q in the first place, is because Reddit had banned it, and that seemed novel at the time. And it seemed like maybe, well, is this where the internet is headed?
So you saw that, and that's what led you to start investigating and setting up this documentary series?
Yeah, because I had a background covering digital privacy.
Did you bring this to HBO and say, hey, look at this?
Very late in the game. So I had been shooting this entirely independently up until September 2020.
You financed it yourself?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Risky, man.
Loan, credit card. Yeah.
Wow.
It was a gamble.
It's a big gamble, right?
Yeah,
but it paid off. Holy shit!
In this case, it did. But it got it to HBO, and it worked out
because it wasn't.
But there was no guarantees that was going to happen.
Well, also, there's no guarantees you were going to have an ending like January 6th. I'm not saying that you were like rooting for something crazy like that to happen, but boy, did that pay off.
I mean, it's almost like you have to predict where things are headed in order to tell a story like this.
Yeah.
I mean, we had put together that whole opening sequence that takes place in D.C. before January 6th. I mean, the ideation for that had started in November. It gave it a whole new meaning, of course, when you see these kind of all of these beliefs and conspiracy theories, or whatever you want to say, kind of overtaking D.C. And you see the kind of characters memeing themselves into existence in that opening. But would the series have been substantially different if that hadn't happened? Of course. And it wasn't even that obvious to most who were working on it in the lead up to the 6th that I needed to go. Because we were in the throes of post, and it was an incredibly aggressive post schedule. Really aggressive. I mean, I was turning out 16 to 18 hour days. Everybody was working around the clock for 5 months straight on this thing. So for me to step away to go shoot at that point, a lot of people thought I was out of my mind. Like, what could possibly be so important that you would drop, editing on this incredibly aggressive post schedule to go and document Jim?
Thank God you did. Right?
I mean,
well, you must have been at the end, like on January 7th. You must have been like, "Fuck yeah!"
I was just like, "Oh fuck." I on January 7th, I think everybody was in a little bit of state of shock.
Yeah.
And didn't really. I hadn't even seen all of the news report. I hadn't seen what everybody else had been seeing because we were on the ground, So it wasn't until it was started looking at all of the footage and all of the archival from other sources that you're like, holy shit, this is what was going on inside.
So what did you see?
I mean, we were on the side where the scaffolding was, where people were climbing all of the scaffolding. I was, following Jim that day. I was very anxious going into it. I didn't really sleep the 2 nights before.
Really?
Because I thought it was going to be bad. I thought it was going to be way worse than it was.
So
I actually thought it could have broken out into a civil war that day. That's how bad I thought it might be.
And why? What led you to think?
Meanwhile, most other folks who, if you weren't tracking all of these movements, I think that they were absolutely, their minds were blown that this could even happen.
That's me. So like I had no idea, right? I had no idea that anything was boiling below the surface. But you thought that it was going to be way worse than what it was.
Yeah.
And what were you tracking that led you to believe this?
Just, I mean, all of these kind of instigators around Trump, Steve Bannon, Roger Stone, General Flynn, they were all stoking the flames to the max. If you looked at the chatter on the chans, if you looked at the chatter on social media in general, around, that this, and Trump asked for a wild protest. I mean, I think as soon as I saw that, knowing what the Q community thought, and knowing what some of these other organizations thought, I mean, I knew more about sort of the Q perspective going into it. But it's like, okay, well, if he's asking for a wild protest, shit's going to get real.
What were his actual words?
He said wild protest. I mean, he wrote that. Like,
it was on Twitter?
Yeah. I'm sure we could pull it up.
Yeah.
But like, he asked for a wild, he's like, there's going to be a wild protest on the
wild
6th.
Protest. And this was a protest, what he believed was election fraud.
Right. And if you listen to his words in the speech that day, he's them's fighting words. We're gonna go there and we're gonna take it back. And so there were a lot of different forces who were pushing that day for something to happen. And for Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act, this is something you'd hear a lot. Ron was saying Trump needs to cross the Rubicon. Like, there was this idea that he needed to, that the only way that they could keep democracy was to overthrow the take things over.
So here it says, this is Trump's Twitter. It says, Peter Navarro releases 36-page report alleging election fraud more than sufficient to swing victory to Trump. A great report by Peter. Statistically impossible to have lost the 2020 election. Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. Will be wild. And what is this 36-page report? Did you get into that?
I don't know the specifics.
Who's this Peter Navarro fellow?
about that, but I do know.
Do you know
that,
who Peter Navarro is?
There hasn't been any, anything of all the lawsuits and everything that's been kicked out there. Nothing is stuck.
So this is the director of the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, Peter Navarro. Yeah. So he thought essentially that getting these people to protest and that this 36-page report, that there would be enough data and that eventually someone somewhere would reverse the decision and prove that there was enough election fraud to reinstate him or to flip the election, give it to him. Right? Is that the idea?
I mean, that day they were certifying the vote. So animosity had been directed towards Pence, who I believe they incorrectly assumed if he didn't certify the vote that it would, or that he could somehow, usurp authority in that case.
Yeah, they were calling him a traitor.
And Ron stoked the flames of that, of course. Like they wanted to release something. They released something that night that made it seem like Pence was trying to run a coup against Trump, to agitate people as much as possible.
They released
Ron and Jim. So they released, they tried to release these documents that you see it in the end of the series where, he's saying the mother of all bombs is coming when it comes to, an information drop. And that information drop was specifically targeting Pence. And there was so much anger towards Pence.
And this is as Ron and Jim. It's not as Q.
Correct. At this point, yeah. Q was done at this point. So now Ron was
how odd is that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's just
how coincidental.
Sure.
And
you could call it a coincidence.
Let's do that. What is the motivation? Like, why do you think Ron is doing this? Like, what's the reason?
Well, he does treat the whole world like it's a game. And what are the objectives of that game? Maybe gaining power, right?
Because he's in contact with the administration at this point.
Think about it. This guy was just running some fringe website out of, Southeast Asia and Japan. And suddenly he's advising, the president. Like he's gotten to the seat of power somehow using that website and Q and his sort of fame that was developed through Q. Remember, Q mentions Ron, Code Monkey, very early on in the narrative. So Q, right at that hijacking point early in January, he's like, Ron, Code Monkey.
How odd.
Yeah. A little bit of theater.
Yeah. That means Q is deeply invested in the community of the board, right?
And it means the community is deeply invested in Ron. And so he was able to pivot that notoriety from obscurity to infamy. And he is interested in infamy. He will embrace infamy, as he has said. So
he's a character. You couldn't ask for better characters. If you had developed this as a drama, if this was fiction,
people wouldn't believe it, probably.
I don't know. There's something to be said for. It's like the two of them, particularly Ron and Jim, and then even Fred. Like all of it is just. It's so weird.
Oh, they're unbelievable characters, to be sure. And you have to say, like, what kind of person would be drawn to becoming an edgelord on something like 8chan, right? And Ron grew up with his dad running Chans. What was it like in that household growing up?
Right.
So, very fascinating character studies, to be sure. And so much of human history, though, is written by people with, I think, not identical tendencies, but people who are driven for power and are willing to do things that others aren't.
Do you think you could ever get Paul to admit that he was the original Q? Would he be in trouble for that? If he admitted it, that would really pull the floor out of the whole thing, wouldn't it?
I think that the fact that the first 127 drops were anonymous in the first place, that there's all these shakeups, there's a style change. Like I think there's lots of the fact that the vast majority of things that Q prophesied or that people believe didn't come true, all the central tenets, the arrests and all that, you would think that would be enough. If you could get Paul to come out and say, yeah, I was it. People would only even believe that if he came with the data. And even then, many still would be like, nah, it's the deep state, it's this, it's that. Like they'll come up with some explanation to write it off. And Paul, he released a whole book after this took place, explaining, his telling his story from that time period. So he was incentivized to keep the narrative alive. And I think that he told me, he's like, I asked him this. I was like, well, if Q was this great military operation, why would they just let a fake Q take it over? And why wouldn't they try to reach out to you and reclaim it? And his answer, which I just think is how he was thinking about it, is, well, maybe they just wanted it to continue. and he thought of it almost like a child, like a baby that had gone out into the world, and it was becoming this big movement, and he wanted to see it continue to grow.
How odd.
Yeah.
How odd. And so Fred started 8chan?
Fred started 8chan on a mushroom trip.
Really?
Well, on the come down from the mushroom trip. He wanted to take the board creation of Reddit and the anonymity of 4chan and basically turn that into 8chan.
And what was the difference? Was it a lack of moderation, or
anybody could create a board? So, but what that meant was that people would go there and create boards with a lot of illegal content. So we had a huge moderation problem in the beginning, because they could post illegal content there, child porn or something like that.
Right.
And they, and first off, there could be hundreds of boards. How is he just able to manage all of that? And they could do it totally anonymously.
And if someone does post stuff and then they take it down, the person who posted that stuff can still post.
They can still post.
Because they can't, it's not like a Reddit user where you could ban the user because they posted illegal content.
And you can ban an IP, but if they're using a VPN, which someone who's doing something illegal like that probably would be using a VPN, unless they're real dumb, it makes it very hard to track. Now, 8chan does respond to government requests for illegal activity like that. All the websites do. Facebook has tons of issues with that kind of material getting posted.
So Fred does it with Jim?
So Fred creates this thing. He creates 8chan, it revs up, and it's not really a huge hit overnight. It's not until Gamergate happens when Chris Poole, who was the owner of 4chan at the time, says, Gamergate, what's going on with these gamers and this whole attack strategy that they're using, too much. I don't want that on this site. He bans all discussion of Gamergate, bans talk around it, creates a lot of animosity in those communities, and they're looking for a new home. And the new home that they go to is 8chan. So suddenly Fred has a huge influx of users. He's like, what do I do? So he needed more resources. He was cash strapped. He was just operating out of a very low rent situation in New York. So he starts getting offers, and he felt that Jim and Ron had experience running chans and would be the best partners. They offered server space for him. They offered to fly him out to the Philippines where he could continue to run 8chan. So for him at the time, that was a pretty good deal. So he got on a plane and headed out to the Philippines. Their relationship over time started to devolve.
What caused that?
Fred would, I think, say that he started to depart philosophically. That maybe they made him kind of uncomfortable in certain situations, like that they weren't taking his safety seriously, things like that. But he also found a wife in the Philippines, and his wife was, her dad was a priest, and he has since described it as and people who I was shooting with there would describe that religion kind of as a cult. So he was newly religious, and 8chan also doesn't jive super well with that philosophy. So, probably he believed in a lot of that stuff. I think Fred is impressionable, and he's also going through life faster than the average person because he doesn't think he's going to live that long. So that could have factored into it. The big riff though that happens between them is, Fred just doesn't really want to work on 8chan anymore. They're giving him too much responsibility in his mind. He doesn't show up to work one day, doesn't show up for a couple of days. Maybe he's going to stop working on it. And that's when Jim, who had given him a place to stay in the Philippines, free of rent, but that Jim owned, just barged into his apartment and was like, "Why aren't you at work?" This Fred's account is that it was very traumatizing for him. And he knew he needed to get out of that situation immediately. So I'm sure that there was a confluence of factors that led to them kind of pulling apart. And also, Fred was young when he created 8chan. He was like 18. So we're talking about somebody who's still growing up.
Right.
And like it's 21. He's like, I don't want to do this. Maybe I don't want to be the
right.
But he still likes that world. And Fred is a very eccentric character, and he likes to lean into that eccentricity as much as possible. And who Fred is online is very different than who Fred is in real life. And both he and Tom, like Tom, who you see, who's Jim Watkins' kind of right-hand man, artist in college, I think that Jim was hoping that Fred was going to have a similar relationship to him, that he would take him under his wing while he was 19 or 20 or whatever, and that he would just continue to be a part of their organization going into later years. And, and Tom, I didn't mention this in the series, but he's a psychonaut. So he loves to experiment with psychedelics. That's his jam. And so he and Fred would do psychedelics like on occasion. So I think that, and they had a good relationship for a long time. And that's why I think Tom is the one that you see when they're trying to smooth things out in the Philippines, when Fred's really going after them, trying to get the side offline. That's why Tom is the sort of most suitable peacemaker in that situation. He's, as Fred would say, sort of the ice to Jim's fire. And then that's also why Tom's pupils, I think, are like this in that one scene. He said it was just the lighting, but I think, he really is into that.
Is
stuff.
Tom the guy who Fred records the conversation they're having and puts it all online?
Yeah, Fred records that conversation and puts it all online
without Tom knowing about it.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's not really the most noble approach when you're trying to negotiate with somebody. Right. I think that Fred was maybe interested in he had gained a new following. He had appeared on a lot of news outlets and stuff in the run up to that happening. And I don't know, he's also known as copy paste. So anything you send to Fred, it's possible that he will simply screenshot it and then share it with someone else.
What is he doing
That's kind
now?
of his tech. That's just his deal, his technique.
What is he doing now?
Well, the other thing that Fred really likes, and I was saying, yeah, you should focus more on this other thing, is fonts. He designs fonts.
Right.
So he's been doing font work for a variety of companies. I don't know. He's probably working on who knows what else he's working on. But he's living with his family now on the East Coast, and his mom and his brother have the same condition he does.
Oh wow!
So he's helping his mom out, living with her. He's still pretty prolific on Twitter. he posts a lot.
So he hasn't been banned.
He's also into furry culture.
What culture?
Furry.
Furries?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Furry culture, which he's been posting about more lately. But yeah, I think he's actually doing a lot better. I think that him being back at home with his mom is a better situation than.
And he's not in trouble in the Philippines,
Oh, he's in trouble in the Philippines. Yeah, he can't go back.
But they don't extradite.
No, we don't. No, they can't extradite him for a cyber libel charge. And that was one of the craziest things to me in all of this. It's like, here you're running an absolutist free speech website, taking it right to the edge, but you're going to go after somebody for something they said on Twitter.
Right, and the thing is, he was saying, there's nothing I can do. Now he's in trouble with the law.
Right, because the way it works in the Philippines is that you, it becomes a criminal suit, so the state takes it over.
Right.
If they determine that there's a case. So when Fred was leaving the Philippines, he got advance notice that an indictment was going to drop.
Yeah, I saw that part of it is very compelling because it's he's under the wire, barely gets out.
Yeah, and
he would have been fucked.
He would have been fucked, especially because COVID was on our heels.
Right. And if he gets COVID, he's already...
it's probably, could have been game over. Especially at that time, we had no idea.
Right. And if he goes to jail, it's most likely he's going to get COVID.
Well, especially in the Philippines. The Bikutan Detention Center, which is for foreigners, he would not fare well there.
Right. Yeah.
And with the COVID stuff ramping up, I have no idea. He could have likely died. I don't think that that's an exaggeration.
No, I don't think it is either. Out of all this, all the time that you spent working on this, when you're alone with your thoughts, and I think that this subject highlights some very important questions and important conversations about free speech and about what roles, if any, these platforms, whether it's 8chan or Twitter or what have you, have in protecting free speech or censoring questionable behavior. And obviously this did not end well, and whether or not 8chan is responsible for some of it, or whether the Q movement is responsible for some of it, or what percentage of it is, it's clear that this becomes a vector for a lot of very questionable ideas and questionable behavior, and what should be done.
Well, that's part of why the approach I took was to be as neutral as possible going into this world, create a historical document and show the mechanics. And, how did all of this actually work? Don't look at the magic trick. Don't look at the spectacle it's generating. Look behind the curtain, so that magic trick can't work again, or at least the exact same magic trick, right? It's like you watch Penn and Teller, and when they reveal the magic trick, sometimes it's actually more magical. But now you know how the magic trick works.
Right.
I struggle with this question. Would you rather live in a world where something like Q is possible? And if not, what's the cost? And this has always been the challenge with any case that kind of tests the limits of free speech. And, it always seems like, well, surely this goes too far. But I think that's why you always get sticky things kind of like this testing free speech. It's not going to be something light and fluffy. It's going to be something that actually has a significant, potentially damaging impact on many people's lives.
Right.
And then we sit back and go, well, what do we do about it? But I think that all rights come with a cost. It's usually on a spectrum of security to freedom. And how much freedom do you want to give up for how much security?
Right.
So, what do you think? Do you think that would you rather live in a world where something like Q is possible?
I'm torn, right? Because on one hand, my perspective is that wouldn't work on me. The flat Earth doesn't work on me. This doesn't work on me. These movements, chemtrails don't work on me. All these movements don't work on me, right?
Right.
So, but would they work on me when I was 15? I think the answer is yes. That therein lies a problem. Would it work on me when I was 20? It may be. 25, likely. 30, maybe not anymore. Then I'm online, and then I'm starting to piece things together in a broader perspective. I'm not looking at things at face value and saying, oh, this is true. I'm going, hold on. And now I'm operating out of a lot of experience, and I'm operating out of, an understanding of how all this shit works in terms of propaganda and nonsense and shit posting and a lot of these things. So should we protect people from things that wouldn't work on you? I'm sure QAnon's not working on you, right? You have a much more sophisticated understanding of how the internet works. So all these things, what are we supposed to do? The rational argument is you counter bad speech with better speech. You explain things in a much more educated or a much more precise.
Well, that's what the series is doing in relation to Q, right?
Yes, for sure.
It's unpacking it.
That's exactly what your series does, right? And at the end of it, it looks preposterous, and it's not going to if a Q drops tomorrow, people are going to be like, bitch, I saw that series, right? So this is the argument for free speech. Because imagine if in a world where you are, like what you were saying earlier, that if it wasn't for HBO and their balls and their bravery. I mean, HBO's like, they can do whatever the fuck they want. They're HBO, right?
And they're like one of the few who still will.
Yes, one of the few who still will. And they did. And, and again, I go back to Bill Maher, but I think he's got a very important show. And it's one of the few that did, one of the few networks that did support him and that kind of program where you are allowed to talk about controversial ideas. If they're taking out people that are criticizing Q as well as supporting Q, then you've got a really weird, slippery thing. Like, you're trying to erase reality. So what happens to the people that were invested in this? They don't get closure. They don't get an understanding. I would hope that a lot of the people, like that one family, the guy with the big neck and his little kid, I would hope they would watch this series and go, Jesus, we got duped. This is kind of nonsense. I would hope. Right?
Yeah,
I hope a lot of these folks...
And a lot have. A lot of folks
so.
who were big Q believers or people who have family who have watched it. I mean, there's been a de-escalation quality to it. Because when you understand what drew people into this, it softens your view of them. And when somebody who believed in all of this sees what was going on behind the scenes and actually engages with the material, for some of them, they can go, okay, well, now I have new information and I can arrive at a new conclusion. You're not telling them how to think. You're just presenting them with ideas and saying, what do you think now?
And this is the argument for free speech, but it shows how complicated it is to unpack something like this. I mean, the amount of time and effort that you put in to expose what this really is pretty substantial.
It's substantial, yeah.
And difficult, I would imagine. Not just amount of time, but you have to frame this. You have, how many hours of footage did you have to go through
to
come
1,600.
Jesus.
Yeah,
to come up with 6 episodes. Holy shit, man.
It was a lot. It was a lot of material.
Holy shit.
I mean, we had multiple angles, right?
But a Herculean effort. But you really managed to nail it. You did a fantastic job. And this is the argument for free speech, because you show that this is most likely 99.999% nonsense, right? We don't really know who posted
sometimes
it.
Q will get a hit,
right? Yeah, right. But the point is, it's like through free speech and through your ability to accurately disseminate information, you've produced a really amazing and entertaining thing that gives people an insight into the psychology behind the folks that believed in this, the psychology behind the folks who are likely perpetrating it. It's an argument for free speech, but it's also shows how fucking difficult it is to really parse this out.
Yeah. I mean, look, conspiracy theories or painting your enemies in a black and white, heaven or hell, all in other terms, that's something that humans have done forever. I mean, even during the Revolutionary War, there were a lot of theories going around about King George,
Yeah.
We wanted to turn everybody into slaves. And I'm sure that 15-year-olds and 20-somethings were impressionable, and it motivated them in those situations. And I do think that the international component does add another element to this that's a little bit different. But that's why I always bring it back to the privacy side. I'd say before we worry about deciding what should or should not be said online, let's restore privacy rights. Let's give people ownership over their data. Let's make it so that these companies can't know more about us than we know about ourselves, and see what impact that has first.
It does seem like that is where everything got really crazy, because your data became a commodity that you didn't know you had. Like, you didn't know it was valuable. So when you signed off on the terms and conditions and you just started posting things and you allowed these companies to track all of your information and all your stuff that you do online, you didn't realize that you were creating these enormous companies with massive amounts of resource that just collect data. They don't necessarily. They have
surveillance
products,
industrial complex.
Right. They have products essentially. Like Gmail is a product. Google's a product. But really, you're the product. Mm-hmm. You're the product because you're what they sell. Like these things, they just offer you that, so you give them the data, and then once you give them the data, then they sell it, and so you're essentially a customer, but you're also what they're selling.
I mean, and I might argue, I think you can argue that January 6th is a byproduct.
How so?
If you trace the lineage of data harvesting to psychometric profiles, to those psychometric profiles being used to target us with information that that is tailored to our insecurities and desires. It drives us into more extreme groups. And then when we move in those more extreme directions, we're less willing to entertain an opposing reality. And then when we're less willing to entertain an opposing reality, we become less willing to hear things from another side because we only believe in our one truth. And then we become more interested in silencing whatever that one truth is. We become more angry. As they say, the hostility of suppression speeds up the treadmill of extremism. The more you shut someone up, the angrier they become, the more it validates the very thing that they were trying to stop in the first place. And then you end up with a cultural climate or a social climate where something like January 6th is possible. So, I don't think it's the only reason, but I think that the data mining was a huge factor, and the data mining in concert with the algorithms, because those algorithms, of course, use the what was reaped from that data mining in order to drive people towards the crazy shit on the internet. Q wouldn't have been possible without the algorithms. Bottom line. Just wouldn't have. It wouldn't have escaped the chance.
So algorithms essentially are there's a problem in the inherent manipulation of people's viewing habits, and they're doing it to accentuate their profits, and they're doing it to accentuate the amount of time that you spend online. Mm-hmm. So.
And to feed us with whatever is most sensational.
Yeah,
I mean, of course,
but not necessarily, right? We talked about like what my algorithms show. That's what I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. Like my friend Ari Shafir pointed this out. Like he decided to do a test where he only looked up puppy videos on YouTube, and then YouTube just started only recommending puppy videos. So it's like the argument becomes...
We get driven into...
Right.
It learns very quickly, and then it reinforces those assumptions.
Right, but it's human nature is the problem, right? It's what people are actually interested in is the problem. Algorithms, they take advantage of our human nature, which is our human nature is to find these echo chambers, is to find confirmation bias.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think a bigger question might be, are algorithms free speech? Do they have, is that an expression of free speech? I mean, we have a court case that I disagree with that asserted that money is free speech. Money is an amplifier.
What court case is this?
Citizens United.
What was the case?
This is the flagship Supreme Court case that actually Barr, who is Jim Watkins' attorney in D.C., he was a part of that case, bringing it to the Supreme Court, which basically said that you could use money in political campaigns, right? It couldn't be directly connected to that politician. There had to be at least the facade of separation. So this is where super PACs came from,
right?
Where you could get huge amounts of money to run what you could call disinformation campaigns against a candidate. And this idea of disinformation also isn't new either. I mean, in my lifetime, the biggest lie that was told was the one that brought us into Iraq, ultimately. Weapons of mass destruction, right? Like that got broadcast and cost how many lives? So these things aren't new. The idea that like a lie can have huge consequences in the world aren't new. But the algorithms are. And I do think that there is a bigger question to be had around should there be some restrictions placed on them? What limitations might we put in place so that we at least know what the rules are? It's a black box of amplification, and it gives incredible power to those who run that black box.
Do you think it's at all possible that algorithms could be exposed in a way where the narrative shifts and we realize that algorithms are actually problematic and that it has done irrevocable damage and it's moved our society in this way, as highlighted in the social network, the social dilemma rather, as highlighted in that, where you're realizing like that the ultimate path for this sort of separation and this reinforcement of tribalism, and that it really leads to like conflict, like almost undeniable. Like we could do something where we could recognize that, first of all, these corporations only exist because we didn't realize that data is a commodity. Once we do realize that data is a commodity, people are giving up that data almost against their understanding. They don't really understand what they're doing until it's too late. They're being duped, right? There's like this gigantic 3-card Monte game going on with your data. And then you have the algorithm problem, and we're recognizing that this is essentially being manipulated. It's being manipulated by foreign entities like the IRA. It's being manipulated by who knows how many other countries that have similar programs installed. What do we do?
Yeah, and what do we do? And you look at Twitter, and do you get rewarded for saying something neutral, or do you get rewarded for saying something hostile?
Hostile.
And the more hostile, the more it satisfies the audience.
Yeah.
The more the person who's posting is trained by that. Mm-hmm. They're trained to go, okay, this is the thing that people want. So it does drive that tribalism, and then it also makes people very sure of whatever that worldview might be, because they can feel that there's a lot of people who like the same thing that they do.
Yeah.
I mean, I know with absolute certainty that the QTubers were reinforced in the same way because they told me that they were. I had Craig, who was in it. We talked afterwards, and he would discuss how, like, he knew what the audience wanted, what he could and could not say, and he wanted to keep that audience. And he was trained over time to say things, around QAnon that would drive more eyeballs. And but at the same time, that became his livelihood. And in the end, after the series came out, and he had said at one point, I still have all these people who follow me who like want to believe that it's all going to come true. But he's like, look around, man. It's a fairy tale. It's like our team. It's like a basketball game. Our team lost, and you guys are still just dribbling around shooting hoops, and the score is over.
Right. What does he do now?
But at the same time, he at that point was not willing to say that to his audience.
Right, because they were still his audience. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What does he do now?
I don't know. I mean, he expressed to me that he was trying to step out of the spotlight some, but I think he's sad that he's told me he's sad that he's like, I just wanted to be a YouTuber. That's all I ever wanted to be, and now I can't be a YouTuber.
Wow.
And
so he can't come back with another channel.
He's banned on everything. Yeah. He could probably go on Tiger Network. So, but I don't know how stable it is, or I don't know anything about it. I haven't really used it. But
and the real problem with banning people is like,
one of the craziest things though that Craig told me, it was in that hot tub scene in the end after he'd just been banned on YouTube. And you could see that was coming in the right up towards the election. That things were going to crescendo in that direction. And he's like, he admitted something to me, which is just that he knew all along that it was the idea that this was a military operation or that Trump was behind the being. He's like, that was a bunch of bullshit. I never believed that. In the beginning, he's like, we're just kidding ourselves. It's just a bunch of a-holes LARPing on 8chan and then suddenly, or 4chan, and then suddenly, in his mind, the military got involved because he had these guys, these ex-military guys reaching out to him and sort of using him as a conduit for their agenda. And so there's that crazy aspect of this too. But it is fascinating to me that he, that he openly admits that it started as a LARP. but it memed itself into reality. And that's what you see come January 6th, is this thing that was casting this imaginary view of the world was trying to make itself real. And in many ways, it didn't actualize all of the beliefs, but some of the central ideas of it. If we assume that Ron is Q, well, Ron eventually managed to get access to the seat of the Capitol. If you want to say that the storm is coming, well, a storm eventually came. This is meme magic at work. This is like a collective imagination that willed something into existence. And I know that's a little bit of a derail from what you were saying before about
it's relevant. Was this ultimately satisfying for you? Like what like obviously your investment paid off. It really you put together a masterpiece. You really did.
But what awesome team. But
everybody involved put together a masterpiece. Shout out to everybody. But was this ultimately satisfying to you, or does this leave you with like a sense of impending doom? Or both?
Well, unpacking the mystery is satisfying. Reaching a conclusion is satisfying. But do I think that we're out of the doghouse? No. Do I think that these patchwork solutions of censorship on these platforms is going to solve the problem that they think it is? No, I think it's going to make it worse. Do I think that it's driving more of a wedge in society? Yes, I do. So if it is in fact the goal to de-escalate things or to make the polarization in society go away, that's this strategy historically and at present. I mean, there's lots of historical examples of how this doesn't work, and why it ends up why censorship ends up having the opposite of its intended effect. And I think we're watching that in real time. But all of these people who are being banned, censored, they didn't disappear just because you don't see them on Twitter. They're mad, and they'll find other platforms, but I think you have to let it work itself out. And if you're going to tinker with something, tinker with the business model. But these companies are never going to offer that as a solution.
Of course.
Ever.
Well, the amount of resources that they've managed to acquire is staggering. There's never been a company like Google before. Imagine a company like YouTube. They own YouTube, right? Yeah. Both of them together. I mean, either one individually, there's never been anything like them. The fact that they're both owned by one company is fucking incredible. And then there's Twitter, and then there's Facebook, and they're both amazing. And Facebook also has Instagram, also an amazing new thing. Like, God, the reach.
And the reach is global. And that's why when we talk about, are we getting out of the quote-unquote doghouse here, it's like, whatever the next war will be, if there's going to be another war, will be borderless, right? Because these ideas seep across borders. The internet is borderless, and the internet is the new world, with its own laws and its own regulations and the companies that are running the rules of those places. And I saw this when I was traveling, South Africa, Macau. I had production assistants who were working with me there who were totally red-pilled on Q-related stuff that they had experienced on YouTube. So the ideas are penetrating abroad. So if the polarization continues, it is not just in America. It is happening ideologically on a global scale. And so it wouldn't be nation versus nation. It would be, these patchworks of ideologies where people have very disparate views of reality. And that's why I'm such an advocate for, folks talking to people that they've sort of stopped listening to. If people who have Q friends or family, or if you believed in Q, like reaching out to family members again, that's going to be a necessary step. But until we fix the privacy problem, I don't see any of this going away, and it may be a runaway train. I hope it's not, but it feels like it right now.
I think that's a great way to wrap this up. And thank you. Thank you for being here and talking to me. And thank you for your incredible amount of work that you put into that HBO series. It's amazing. I
really, really appreciate it. And thank you for having me on and for watching all 6 episodes and then rewatching some of it.
My pleasure.
It was just it's been a great conversation. Thank you.
We're fucked. Bye, everybody.
But there's hope.
There's hope, I guess. Yeah. We're here. Yeah. We're okay now.
You can try without hope.
Yes.
That's what I say.
We can try without hope. All right. Bye, everybody.